Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you're joining us from in the Commonwealth and beyond. I know that we've got people joining from right across the world, which we're, of course, delighted to see and all very much welcome. It's an enormous pleasure to welcome everyone to the first day of the CPA's three-day virtual conference on artificial intelligence, disinformation and Parliament, ensuring the integrity of our digital democracy. My name is James Pennell, and I'm the Deputy Head of Programmes here at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, primarily responsible for all multilateral engagements, including this virtual conference. We're delighted to be joined by esteemed and experienced speakers and panellists from across the world and from across disciplines, across sectors, both today and for the following 2 days. I don't want to take up too much time with housekeeping. I'm conscious we have some very distinguished speakers lined up, and certainly nobody has registered for this conference to hear me drone on about housekeeping and technical matters. However, just a few things to note from ourselves. Firstly, to remind all speakers and attendees that this conference is being recorded. I imagine you all got a little message when you joined to let you know that fact, although it's not being live streamed. Should anybody wish to request a part of this webinar not be included in the final recording, please do not hesitate to contact the CPA Headquarters Secretariat and advise accordingly. We're also looking to upload the various sessions to our YouTube pages. I know that a number of people have been in touch with us about having access to recordings after the conference, including those who aren't able to join us. So please do let any colleagues that you know of who were hoping to join us but who couldn't, that is going to be the case. All attendees will have noted they don't have the ability to unmute or turn cameras on. However, should you be experiencing any technical difficulties during the conference, either today or for the following 2 days, should you be joining us for all 3 days, please do use the Q&A or chat function on your screen to alert myself or my colleagues who are also supporting this conference, and we will assist accordingly. A number of our sessions will feature Q&A sessions. And if you would like to pose a question to the panel, either as part of those Q&A sessions or for any other reason, please do direct it through the Q&A function, which should be on the right of your screens, or alternatively use the chat function, and certainly do use the chat function to discuss matters amongst yourselves. That's why it's there. We're all about peer-to-peer learning at the CPA, so please do take advantage of that. If you are posing a question and you've joined this webinar anonymously, we would just kindly ask that you indicate your name and where you are attending from. As part of that, we would ask as well that you just keep your name visible as standard and as a matter of courtesy. We do always like to ensure we're tracking learning and development at all of our events and programs. So we will be asking attendees to answer a poll at the beginning of each day or at the beginning of each day's schedule, and then another at the conclusion of that day's schedule. We invite all attendees to respond to these polls, even those in attendance who might consider themselves experts in the topics that we're covering. And I know we do have several experts joining us, which we're delighted to see. But even if you consider yourself an expert, please do fill out the poll. It's a single question poll, and many thanks in advance for that. So if a colleague could maybe share that poll already, if they haven't done so already. Super. Like I say, please do respond. Great. Congratulations, who is ever the first to respond. It's good to see. And I'll just give maybe 30 seconds or so for everyone to have time to fill it out. I should say these are all anonymous responses as well, so don't be afraid to fill it out. And again, this is just for today. I think we maybe have 10 more people to fill it out. I don't know if those 10 are shy. Like I say, it is anonymous, we promise. I think those, oh, one more. Okay, that's now been on the screen for a good minute, so I think we'll end the poll there. And thank you very much to everyone who took time out for that. Like I say, it does help us with our monitoring and our evaluation and understanding the learning and development requirements of all participants at our event. So again, very much appreciated. We do also try and maintain an atmosphere of respect at all of our events. I'm sure that won't be an issue here, but we do ask that all comments, all conversations using the chat function do remain respectful and courteous at all times. And without further ado, I think, like I say, nobody joined to listen to me speak about housekeeping matters. You're all here because you're interested in this topic, and it's great to see that level of interest. And I want to invite our Secretary General, Mr. Stephen Twigg, to make some opening remarks and give his own welcome to this virtual conference. So, Stephen, I'll hand over to you.
James, thank you very much indeed. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of those who've joined for this opening session for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association's online conference on artificial intelligence, disinformation and Parliament, ensuring the integrity of our digital democracy. And this is the second in a series of CPA conferences on the fourth industrial revolution, the first of which was held in July of 2021. This is an opportunity for participants to really dig that little bit deeper this time with this particular focus on AI, artificial intelligence, and synthetic media. I think the broad general observation that I'm keen to make in this opening session is that what we're seeking to foster over these next 3 days is a nuanced and informed discussion. AI is one of those subjects that gets increasing attention in public discourse, and it's often very easy to fall into a position of either lauding its virtues or condemning its vices. And what we're seeking to do through the various sessions over these next 3 days is to take a nuanced view, to recognize the potential strengths and advantages that AI can bring to the modern world in terms of, for example, decision making, in terms of productivity of many industries, services, and areas of public life. Indeed, the potential for AI to save significant numbers of lives. But at the same time, and perhaps in particular in the context of the work that we do in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association with sister organisations and with our members across the Commonwealth, is to face up to some of the very real risks, and most notably those that relate to disinformation. So as James has set out already, over these next 3 days, what we are doing is bringing together a diverse range of expert voices with the goal of both increasing awareness and knowledge about the challenges, opportunities and risks presented, but also to promote, as we always seek to do, the peer-to-peer learning that James spoke about, mutual learning, which lies at the very heart of the mission of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. When we adopted our strategic plan 2 years ago, we identified a number of key priority cross-cutting themes for our work. And one of those is technology and innovation. We seek in our regular work as the CPA to engage with parliaments, with legislators, with parliamentary staff, and indeed, crucially, with others on a set of important issues, many of these that relate to technology and innovation are ones that many of us, and I include myself very much in this, may sometimes feel quite unfamiliar with. This is an ever-changing area of work, and often people can feel quite uncomfortable about that. And the spirit of our event this week, but also the ongoing work of the CPA, is to provide a really accessible space in which these absolutely vital questions can be discussed and considered together. Now, next year, 2024, is going to be a very big year in the electoral calendar of many countries around the world. Of course, the elections in the United States will, as they always do, attract particular attention. But within the Commonwealth, we are going to see national elections in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in South Africa, and almost certainly in the United Kingdom as well. And of course, that is very relevant to some of the sessions that we are holding during this event over the next 3 days. The risks around fakes and the use of artificial intelligence in those contexts are especially potent during election periods, and that will be addressed during this event. Of course, whilst especially potent during election periods, they are not confined to such periods. And there have been a number of notable examples in different parts of the world of deep fake videos being widely circulated. And I'll refer to one that may be familiar, particularly to any British attendees, but maybe less so to the many non-UK attendees at our event. It's a recent example, and it relates to the leader of the opposition in the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, who was attending his party conference in Liverpool, and a video emerged which appeared to show him chastising his staff, swearing, and criticising the host city of Liverpool. This was a widely viewed video on social media, but it was absolutely revealed to be a deep fake. As well as this week's online conference, another strand of work that the CPA has been developing is a handbook on disinformation, artificial intelligence, and synthetic media. And we're very pleased to be taking the opportunity of this online conference to launch this new publication, which you can download on our CPA website. We've developed this in partnership with the Organization of American States, and I want to put particular thanks to the OAS for their partnership in developing this resource. Its aims are very straightforward and align, of course, with the aims of this conference to build awareness about the challenges around artificial intelligence and disinformation, and then to share strategies to combat disinformation. Please do take a look, and all feedback, as ever, as James has said, is very, very welcome. Partnership is critical for our work. We work primarily to parliaments and parliamentarians, and looking at the attendee list, I want to welcome the participants who are joining us from all over the Commonwealth and beyond, from many different jurisdictions, including speakers and presiding officers and other parliamentarians and parliamentary staff. I want to finish now by wishing everyone a fruitful, constructive, and I hope enjoyable 3 days of discussion. And if I might in particular give my thanks to all of those who've made this possible, James and the others in the CPA headquarters team, Tom Davis and Jack Hardcastle, who are here today as part of this opening session, and above all to give my thanks to the various panelists who've kindly offered their time to add their expertise to the discussions over these 3 days. Thank you very much indeed, and please everyone have a successful conference.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for those warm words. And yeah, absolutely, it's a key thematic priority for us, technology and innovation. And as you've already mentioned, this idea of deep fakes, what is real, what is not real, and the impact that can have on democracy and informed decision making. I think that's a priority area for a great many of our stakeholders and a great number of those who are joining us for the conference, both today and for the following 2 days. We do have a keynote address, but the speakers are unable to join us so far. I think there may be some technical issues being involved there. However, I have seen that the presenter for our first substantive session has joined us. So a very warm welcome to Heidi Tworek, who has joined us bang on time, which is enormously appreciated. So maybe I think there's going to be a slight tweak to the running order, perhaps just as we help our keynote speaker to allow her to join in good time. Maybe we proceed with Heidi, and I'll invite my colleague Jack Hardcastle to introduce Heidi and this session. So Jack, I'll hand over the microphone to yourself.
Thanks, James, and thank you, Stephen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. As my colleagues mentioned, my name is Jack Hardcastle. I'm a Programmes Manager at the CPA Secretariat, and I'll be supporting James and others in facilitating this conference with you over the next few days. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first session of this important conference on AI, disinformation and Parliament. As James mentioned, all of your presence here today underscores, I think, the significance of our shared interest in understanding and confronting the challenges posed by disinformation and the increasing challenges that the advent of AI is posing in this sphere. I think we've heard some important insights into the rationale and importance of this conference, and I think particularly in relation to our CPA membership and members of Parliament as well. So without further ado, I'm happy to move into the first session of this conference on history of disinformation. We'll delve into the roots and evolution of disinformation, tracing its impact through history. And really, this isn't just an academic exercise. I think understanding the past is crucial for tackling the sophisticated challenges we face today, particularly with the advent of AI-generated disinformation. As the first session, it aims to serve as an important primer for the rest of the conference, and it'll lay the groundwork for a deeper understanding of how disinformation has been and continues to be a powerful tool in shaping public opinion and influencing democratic processes. Equally important, the session will also acknowledge where the limitations of historical parallels lie in addressing contemporary challenges. For this session, I'm delighted to say that we are joined by our distinguished speaker, Dr. Heidi Tworek. Heidi is the Canada Research Chair, Director of the Centre for the Study of Democratic Institutions, and Associate Professor at the University of British Columbia. Her research and insights into the historical and current impacts of disinformation will be invaluable to our discussions, I have no doubt. So I'm happy to welcome you, Heidi, and we'll shortly be hearing your presentation on this topic. Just for quick housekeeping, James obviously has already gone over the most important things, but in terms of the running order for this session, we'll have approximately 30 minutes. We'll first hear from Heidi, and then we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A. As James mentioned, we will have written submissions through the chat or Q&A function. So for those attendees that wish to pose a question, we would encourage you to do so at any point during the session, and we'll do our best to go through those and pose those to Heidi towards the end of the session. So without further ado, Heidi, I'm happy to hand over to yourself for your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jack. Thank you to everybody for attending at what I know are many, many different times around the world. Despite my British accent, I am joining you from British Columbia, Canada. So I'm very happy to be here and to talk about this topic because, as both Stephen and Jack noted, this is a topic that, of course, has such contemporary resonance, and yet it also has a very long history. So before we begin, just a very brief definition of what we're actually talking about when we talk about disinformation. So misinformation, I tend to think of as misleading or false, but people don't necessarily know that they're sharing something that is false. They don't necessarily intend to cause harm. What I'm talking about in my presentation is the disinformation, where something is deliberately spread by malign actors with some sort of harmful aim, and where those actors may have political motivations, or they may have economic motivations to make money, or indeed they may have both. Now, disinformation is not a new phenomenon. In fact, we could argue that disinformation has existed for as long as news, and that it continues to morph with every new technology and new mode of presenting information. In fact, all the way back as far as 1620, when we had the growth of the first newspapers in England, we see that Ben Jonson, a playwright who is really only second to Shakespeare in the 17th century, actually produced something called a masque, which he performed at the court of King James II, which was mocking people's gullibility on fake news. So in this case, this was called News from the New World as Discovered in the Moon. And it's a satire of how people were so gullible about news that they believed that there were people living in the moon. So ever since the beginning of newspapers, we've also had disinformation be spread by different powers for diplomatic and other reasons. And we've also had playwrights and others satirizing the reader's gullibility in different ways. So the question then is less whether disinformation exists historically, but rather why do certain people or certain states choose to engage in disinformation at different points in time. So what I'm going to do then in this sort of kickoff presentation is give one example from my own historical work of when a particular country, Germany and its elites, become really invested in using news and disinformation to achieve broader political, economic, and cultural aims. So I'm going to give that example from this historical research, and then just end by thinking about some uses of history that I hope will be quite practical in terms of why we'd actually want to think about history at all when we have so many things that appear so unprecedented, like generative AI. Okay, so first we'll think then through this example, which has come out of my own research, as I said, which culminated in a book published a couple of years ago called News from Germany. So if this piques your interest, there's a book where you can go and read a couple hundred pages about this story. So in March of 1917, when World War I is raging and the United States is about to enter into the war, it's moving into a crucial phase, you would think that German satirical magazines and newspapers would be really concerned with questions around the United States or around weapons, etc. But actually what we find is the satirical magazines, such as one pictured here called Kladderadatsch, what they really care about is news and disinformation. So this satirical magazine produces an entire special issue polemicizing against the main British news provider, Reuters. And this is one example of the many cartoons or poems that are included in this special issue. Here it says in German, Die Lüge ist der Weltgesetz, dies lehrt das Reuters Kabelnetz. Or lies are the law of the world, Reuters cable network teaches that. And here we see the Reuters news agency portrayed as a gremlin in a somewhat anti-Semitic fashion because the founder of Reuters was Jewish, and out of his sharpened fingernails come cables which, according to this German magazine, were purportedly spreading lies and disinformation around the world. A reminder that for Germans in the midst of World War I, one of the key issues for them was what they perceived to be disinformation. And they thought that the key purveyor of this was not necessarily newspapers, but actually the bottleneck of news, the news agency that existed behind the newspaper and that cooperated with the still comparatively new technology of cables. So just to briefly explain, because I'm sure you all know, but still what a news agency is, it's akin to Reuters or the Associated Press in the United States, Canadian Press in Canada, etc. It is in many ways the main bottleneck of news. Emerges in the mid-19th century with the spread of submarine cables as a way to collect large amounts of news, spread it through submarine cables and deliver it to newspapers. So it's the main provider of news, the main bottleneck of news, and one that is often hidden to most newspaper readers. In fact, in the mid-1920s, for example, 90% of German newspapers were using news agencies for their news from both the capital Berlin and their foreign news as well. Now, from the start, news agencies found it quite expensive to gather news, and so there were very few of them because there were very high fixed and sunk costs to actually be able to gather news from around the world and send it through submarine cables. So the initial few news agencies, which included Reuters, set up what was a cooperative agreement, a cartel between them. They divided the world, they collected news from specific regions, and they exchanged it between them. Reuters, the British news agency, and Havas, the French news agency, covered most of the world because they had major empires, and because the German news agency Wolf didn't really see that it was particularly important to cover large amounts of the world. But this started to change from around the 1890s. And this is where we get into explaining why disinformation becomes important to certain states at certain times. So from the 1880s, 1890s, Germany started to believe that it should become a global power. Before that, it had been a more continental power, but started to believe it should be a colonial and global power from the 1880s, 1890s. Many German elites looked at this news provision system and felt that it was actually very disadvantageous to Germany's political ambitions. They came to believe that you needed to have news from Germany that reached the rest of the world to be able to bolster Germany's global aspirations. So we see there's a political motivation for Germany wanting to intervene in news and to spread news that was somehow advantageous to a German point of view. This political aim then coincides with economic aims as well. Germany is becoming ever more important in terms of global trade through the Second Industrial Revolution. We can see here steadily gaining in its percentage of world exports. And for many German industrialists, they worried that the kind of news that people were receiving in, say, Latin America or East Asia was not, in fact, one that was advantageous to German interests, that this was actually undermining German economic aspirations. They believed you needed German news from a German point of view to actually be able to increase Germany's exports continually after this point. These political and economic concerns then coincide with technological concerns as well. So in 1902, Britain finishes its laying submarine cables all around the world that only touch on British imperial territory, laying the final line between Vancouver, where I am now, and Australasia. So this meant that Britain could send submarine cable messages around the world without having to have those cables dock on anything other than British imperial soil. Now, for a long time, other powers, whether France, the United States, or Germany, had seen this technology as somewhat neutral, that cables was something that could be used by everyone. But by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, Germans start to believe that if Britain controlled the technology of cables, they could also control the messages that were being sent as well. And so they feared that this could again undermine German political and economic aspirations. So what Germany does is both to try to lay submarine cables, but also to invest in a new technology that could bypass submarine cables altogether. They start to invest in something that would be known at the time as wireless technology, later to be known as radio. And by the time we get to the outbreak of World War I, the German government has subsidized a network of wireless towers around the world to try to create a wireless parallel to the British all-red submarine cable route around the world. Now, this is not very well known because World War I breaks out soon afterwards. And one of the main things that the British and Australians and others try to do at the beginning of World War I in a global sphere is actually to conquer these wireless towers. So we see that as long ago as 1914, governments recognize that new technologies can be used for disinformation and propaganda, and they seek to ensure that that doesn't continue. Nevertheless, the German government continues to try during the war to invest in wireless towers, tries to secretly set up a new set of wireless towers on neutral countries' territory, and to improve the technological means of wireless towers. And in fact, by 1917, the Germans have built the tallest wireless tower in the world at a place called Nauen, just outside of Berlin. And they claim that it had strong enough signal that it would be able to reach all the way to Australia, though we're not sure if that's actually what occurred. But what we see then is that even despite the way that we focused in World War I, often on thinking about other aspects of the war, disinformation was a huge part of what is happening over 100 years ago. Information warfare is a crucial part of how this war is being fought. And that's because German elites had, for nearly 20 years prior to that, seen information as a key part of how states should operate. And they had really invested in this in a way that some other states had not recognized. So then by 1917, what the German state seeks to do is to try to use a whole host of different news agencies. The names are not important, but merely just to demonstrate there are a lot of them, to try to spread all types of news from Germany that portrays a German point of view. Now, obviously, as time goes on, what that German point of view is will change dramatically, whether it is during World War I or the Democratic Weimar Republic, but this will go all the way into the Nazi period as well. And I'm going to give you just a few examples of how widespread this infrastructural network is to show us that when we're thinking about problems of disinformation, we need to think about that technological infrastructure as well, which enables disinformation to be spread far and fast. So we're going to just look at a couple of examples of the final news agents here, one called Transocean, or I'm going to call it Transocean for ease here, one that is founded just before World War I, but fundamentally relies on those new wireless networks that I have just shown you. So even during the early years of World War I, when the United States is still neutral, we've often believed that actually German news didn't really reach Americans, that German propaganda wasn't effective, and that it was full of sort of bumbling people who would leave their suitcases in subways so that you could know what Germans were trying to do. But actually what I have discovered using a whole host of new digitized newspapers is that this isn't really the case. Actually, what we see if we trace news agencies is that many, many Americans were reading German propaganda and German disinformation during the years when the United States was neutral during World War I. In fact, all the black dots here represent all of the newspapers that were actually printing news provided by a German news agency sent by the new technology of wireless across the Atlantic. So if you were someone living, for example, in fairly rural Utah, a lot of your vision of World War I was actually coming from a German news agency. You just didn't necessarily know it because you didn't necessarily understand that that was a German news agency, because you were reading that news in your local newspaper. So this then another historical lesson that often when a state is trying to send different types of information, they don't necessarily want the readers to know it came from them, right? They want it to be in some way concealed or hidden, and that makes that information or disinformation even more powerful. So understanding the networks behind the obvious news is extremely, extremely important to be able to trace where disinformation is coming from, because often those who purvey it seek to conceal its origins. Once the United States enters into the war, the US Navy will actually take the Sayville wireless station, which was receiving much of this information from Germany. And so obviously after 1917, there isn't such a widespread of German information within the United States. After World War I is over, in the Versailles Treaty, there's actually one clause which forbids Germans from using wireless towers for 6 months after the treaty is signed to try to prevent the kind of propaganda that the Allies had seen during the war. For bizarre reasons that I haven't ever been able to understand, the Versailles Treaty lists which wireless stations can't be used, and they leave one off. So even for those 6 months, the Germans are able to use one wireless tower to disseminate news from Germany. Now, of course, after World War I, Germany becomes a democratic country, becomes the Weimar Republic. But many people are still the same people who served in government even prior to World War I. And for those all across the political spectrum, what they believe World War I has shown them is the power of information, the importance of getting news from Germany out around the world. And so during the Weimar Republic, successive governments, no matter their political stripe, continue to invest in this. And what this means is that by the time we get to 1933, when the Nazis will come into power, Transocean has a very large network, which is particularly focusing on places outside of Europe that then the German government can reach directly through the new technology of wireless, whether it is Latin America, East Asia, or large numbers of places in the Middle East and Africa as well. And what this means then is when the Nazis come to power, they have a technological network they can take advantage of. They obviously radically change the content of what is being disseminated to be anti-Semitic, homophobic, much more disinformation, propaganda, and so on. But the point is that they have that technological network to be able to build on in the first place. And this is, again, wildly successful. So in a way similar to World War I, often the Nazis are trying to conceal the origins of this news. By sending it through a news agency, it's then printed in a local newspaper in, for example, Sao Paulo, where the readers are not necessarily going to know that this was originally news from Germany. And so we see there are many newspapers in both Latin America and East Asia that even in 1941 are printing news from Transocean. And in fact, even in Asia, we see that in many places in Japanese-occupied China, there's actually more news being printed from this German news agency than from the news agency of the Japanese occupiers. So there is in many ways a world war of words being waged to push German propaganda and disinformation around the world through a technological network that was built in the 30, 40 years before the Nazis came to power. And in fact, even in the United States, this will attract the attention of someone as prominent as J. Edgar Hoover, because he fears that this is not just a network of propaganda, this is actually a network of espionage as well. Now, of course, once World War II is over, the Allies recognize the importance of propaganda and they dismantle the system that I have described. So we might say, well, isn't this just a historical episode? It's not particularly useful for parliamentarians. Why should we care about any of this history at all? So I'm going to end by suggesting a couple of ways that I think these kinds of historical episodes are actually tremendously useful for policy makers. The first one of these is that, especially in communications, actually things are surprisingly path dependent. If we look at where the first fiber optic cables are laid for the internet, they're actually laid along the same lines as where the original submarine cables were laid in the mid-19th century that I've described. So many of the connections that we have today follow very similar paths. So if we want to understand who is connected to the internet, why, we actually have to go back to the mid-19th century because of this path dependency. And that's because it was so expensive to do ocean bed sounding that every telephone and submarine cable that came subsequently used exactly the same kinds of routes because it was simply cheaper than doing their own ocean bed sounding. So there's a lot of path dependency in the types of technologies we use and who has access to them. Secondly, we also see very basically a lot of parallels to the present from the story that I described and where we are today. One is simply economic. What we see in the story that I've described is that elites are looking for what they see as the bottleneck of news provision, that rather than supplying disinformation or propaganda to hundreds or thousands of newspapers, the German elites saw it as much more efficient to simply have a news agency, which then itself supplied hundreds of newspapers. And so today, when we want to think about where do we look for disinformation, it can often be useful to look at the bottleneck of information provision. So if we think about platforms, for example, social media platforms, rather than worrying about every single individual who's posting on them, we want to think about those platforms, those bottlenecks of information provision. The second parallel is very simply technological. In the story I've told, we see this interplay between there's a technological infrastructure that's new, a rising power seeks to use that new technology and infrastructure to then spread information. So that we need to think about that interplay between infrastructure and information. I think we're much more attuned to that today, post Huawei, than we were 5 to 10 years ago. But we have to remember that even companies like Facebook or Google also invest in cables, fiber optic cables as well. So we've got the cloud wars, we've got questions of surveillance, but we've also got the question of whether we should allow and how should platforms be investing in this infrastructure. And very finally, I think what history can help us do is really understand what's unprecedented about this moment. And undoubtedly, there's a great deal. Generative AI is creating all sorts of new ways of producing information very cheaply. But there's also a lot about this moment that's actually quite precedented. And it can be very helpful, I think, in trying to get up to solutions to know what is unprecedented and what is not. So things like, for example, information being part of geopolitical rivalries, I would argue really that is a feature and not a bug of the international system. We are going to have to come to grips with this, not just for the next 5 years, but for the next 50 or 500. It is rare when we don't see information warfare or disinformation as part of the competitive international system. So with that, I will thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to answering all of your questions, and thank you again to the CPA for seeing history as important enough to kick off this kind of conference. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Heidi. Fascinating presentation. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I think, as we mentioned at the start of the session, a good primer as we begin to look at these more contemporary challenges, particularly as it relates to the birth and growth of AI-generated disinformation. As I mentioned, we do have opportunity now for some questions. So I'd encourage those attending who wish to pose a question, please use the chat function and the Q&A function. And myself and colleagues will try to navigate this in live time and pose some questions to Heidi. I think maybe I'll kick off as we manage that process behind the scenes, Heidi, and maybe touch upon the last part of your presentation, which I think was particularly useful, and I think particularly useful for those that are directly involved in trying to combat disinformation in the contemporary age as looking to our legislatures and those involved within Parliament as well. And you looked at some of the parallels and uses of history. I thought that maybe you could perhaps expand upon maybe some of the uses, as you mentioned, as using history as a tool for contemporary challenges, but maybe where some of the limitations of analogies come into play with a particular eye towards this newer challenge of AI generated disinformation. And then beyond that, we can then maybe pose some more specific questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. It's a really important question. So I think a couple of things come to mind. One is the way in which this can be so individually tailored at this point. So the era that I describe is much more mass media, right? But we're now in a moment where the amount of data that companies or potentially states have about us mean that they can individually tailor the sort of disinformation that comes to each individual based upon our prior interests and so on and so forth, right? And that is on a scale that we simply do not have at this moment when things are done in a much more mass fashion. So that's number one. And number two is the low barrier to entry to a lot of other groups to be able to purvey disinformation. So the moment that I describe, you would have to be a pretty major individual, or you would have to be a state in order to be able to really pay to use all the infrastructure I describe. But the moment we are in now is where you can be somebody in Macedonia, right? And you can set up a huge operation on Facebook with relatively little startup capital. So those to me are two of the main differences: the individual tailoring based on our data and the low barrier to entry that we now see for purveyors of disinformation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Heidi. We do have questions coming in, so please bear with me. I'll try and filter ones that are relevant to this session. I must say we do have a number of sessions throughout today and the next 2 days, so I have a feeling that some of these questions may be better tailored for future sessions. So to those attendees, we will try and filter these questions based upon which session they're most suitable for. We do have a question from Trevor Clark, and I think this looks at some of the state actors' disinformation campaigns, and particularly in the contemporary age. And he asks, is modern day China as strong as Transocean was in terms of reach? And are some of the media channels, so he referenced, I think, Russia Today and CCTV, as much as a threat to the BBC as is, I think, thought?
Yeah, Trevor, it's a great question. I'm gonna answer it by talking about China, but actually say that I do think still news agencies are incredibly important. So if we look at the history of contemporary China's attempt to spread information from China around the world, we have to start with Xinhua. And that begins even in the 1980s. I had a master's student who wrote a great thesis actually looking at how China tried to use Xinhua starting in the 80s already to send news from China to particular places around the world. So that's number one. Keep looking at news agencies. They still are important. And number two is, again, just like with the German story, we see this is actually something that's been going on since at least the 80s. It's just that now we've become much more attuned to it. If we want to think about how strong it is, I guess I would say possibly in the sense that it does something, China's doing something quite similar to Transocean in that they are looking to spread this information in places that are of interest to China, right? And they're often not necessarily the same places we might think of. So if you look in Africa, for example, that's where actually there's quite a large amount of spread of Chinese information, because there are obviously now growing and deep economic ties between Africa and China. It's hard to assess if they're exactly as strong, but I would say that there's obviously deep embedding of Xinhua and also CCTV in multiple places around the world. And it behooves us to understand that it's taken some decades to get there. And then the other thing I would say is, of course, we see with China, it's that same interplay of infrastructure like 4G or 5G and provisions of that alongside providing a news agency or having a TV channel, et cetera, et cetera. So that same interplay is something that we see as a parallel with the story that I told.
Thank you, Heidi. I see that we are joined by our keynote speaker from the opening, so we are going to try and rejig things slightly. So I think we'll try and end this session as close to 6 as possible. There are a few more questions, Heidi, which I'll try and get to you before we finish. The next one is from Daryl Hall, and I think this is a specific one related to particularly the case study you gave with Germany. And his question was about why the newspapers and the media outlets in the USA printed stories from German news distributors when there were other alternatives, perhaps more other legitimate alternatives. And beyond that, were they knowingly reprinting disinformation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sometimes it's hard to delve into because we don't have the archives of all of these newspapers, but there are a couple of answers. One is that it was for economic reasons. This news was free. So one of the things that the German government was doing was subsidizing this news because they felt that there were bigger financial gains to be had. So one of the things that obviously a cash-strapped newspaper might do is happily take something that is offered for free rather than having to pay for it. So that's something to bear in mind. Another is that sometimes they really were doing it unknowingly. So they were receiving it from another news agency that had a contract or was also disseminating it. So in many cases, the newspapers or the journalists didn't necessarily know that they were printing news from Germany. And then finally, in some cases, they didn't necessarily have alternatives. So not necessarily in the US, but in some other places, they didn't always have alternatives. For example, Reuters was too expensive or it wasn't available, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when we're thinking about why we see newspapers or outlets print disinformation, there's a whole range of possibilities. Occasionally it can also have to do with, of course, the sympathies of the editor themselves, but often it's much more pragmatic, like they need something that's free, they need to fill space, and they've got to print really frequently. And we see some of those pressures even today, right? On an online outlet where a journalist is told they have to write 8 to 10 stories a day, you don't have time to actually check the background of a lot of the information. And this is how we saw in 2016, for example, almost every serious news outlet ended up printing and posting some tweets that were coming out of Russian disinformation. And that's because they didn't spend enough time doing all of the checks to see that it was legitimate. So all these kinds of pressures in the news industry are some of the reasons why then disinformation actors can end up having their material be printed quite widely.
Brilliant, thank you. I think the next question follows on from that actually quite well. And this is an anonymous question. And they ask, how do we ensure that newsrooms are not susceptible to the same tactics used by the Nazis, for example, in the present day? So I think an extension of the last point, but looking more the contemporary issue.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole host of things from the small details to the big economics of the news industry. So in terms of the small details, some of the things that I've recommended have been very simple. Like if you are going to post a tweet inside a news story, just spend the time to ask the person if they will talk with you on the phone for 5 seconds. If they refuse, that maybe is a red flag, right? That they may not be the person that they say they are. Obviously, this requires then bigger things like maybe you need more staff. Maybe you can't actually have that many stories from one journalist on an individual day. But I think we can try and think about it as a multi-level problem where some things are about basic newsroom operation, making sure that as you would with any other source, your sources online are actually reliable, because we saw that not happen quite frequently. And then you need to think about how do you staff up a newsroom to be able to do that. And then in the bigger scheme of things, thinking about where your major sources are coming from, so your news agencies, etc. So we see, for example, if you're in a place where there isn't that much funding for news, then the incentives to take something that's free are going to be so much greater. So does there need to be more support for public media to make sure that you don't have those kind of economic incentives? And we see this as, I would say, a broader debate just at the moment in Canada about things like whether Google and Facebook should be paying for news through something called the Online News Act or not, how much money, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say that for me, those debates are tied up with the disinformation debate, because if we have strong public media that are well staffed, then they have the time to do the kinds of things that I'm suggesting.
Brilliant. Thank you, Heidi. I think some of the remaining questions we have are more geared towards some of the later sessions. I think some of the links back to Parliament as an institution, for example, and the role of parliamentarians we'll delve into, particularly later on today and also in tomorrow's sessions as well. So I think on that note, I might draw this session to a close as we approach 6 o'clock. As I mentioned, we had a slight change in the schedule. But on that note, Heidi, I'd like to give a big thank you for opening up the conference. I think we've been a really important primer of the session as we delve further into the role of AI-generated disinformation and how that impacts democratic processes and on our parliamentary institutions as well. So a big thank you to you, Heidi. Feel free to stick around for the remainder of the conference. We have a number of other sessions today. And on that note, I'll be happy to hand back to my colleague, James. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jack, and enormous thanks to Heidi. I think that was an excellent primer on all things disinformation. I have seen that our panelists for our session on an introduction to AI, current and future perspectives, but I'm also conscious that we have been joined by our keynote speaker, who I have heard speak quite recently on some of these topics and who we're delighted to be joined by. And that is the Right Honourable Chloe Smith MP, former UK Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, and Member of Parliament for Norwich North in the United Kingdom. Chloe, we're absolutely delighted to have you join us. Chloe has been MP for Norwich North since 2009 and was also Secretary of State for Work and Pensions in addition to the Science, Innovation and Technology portfolio, and she has held a range of other ministerial posts since 2010, including as Minister for the Constitution, responsible for electoral law across a full decade. She speaks about science and technology, the economy and future of work, accessibility and inclusion, and also cancer awareness. She was jointly named 2023's most influential person in UK tech and was in the top list of 2022's Women in Westminster the same year she overcame breast cancer. Chloe has also played an historic role in providing the first ever maternity cover for a department at the cabinet table, and the CPA being an organisation that prioritises gender mainstreaming, gender sensitivity, inclusion and diversity. We're absolutely delighted that you're able to play that historic role. Chloe, an enormous congratulations to you. Chloe will be standing down from Parliament in 2024 and is a mother of two who love cycling and canoeing. So Chloe, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you again so much for joining us, and the floor is all yours.
James, thank you very much indeed, and my apologies for the change in your running order, but I thought that the earlier presentation was absolutely excellent, and in fact I might be able to come back to a few points of it by the end of my remarks. So James and Secretary General, and to all attendees, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. It's fantastic to have an inclusive debate coming together on so many aspects of AI, and what you've chosen for your conference is a really vital strand of that. Many Commonwealth nations have elections next year: Bangladesh, Botswana, Ghana, India, Kiribati, the Maldives, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, Pakistan, Rwanda, the Solomon Islands, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Tuvalu, likely the UK we expect, as well as further afield, the US, Indonesia and Mexico. So covering billions of voters going to the polls. While digital infrastructure will vary between nations, for many citizens, these elections will have a major online element. Integrity of information matters so that people's free choices achieve what they intend. AI will be a player. For some, it's a threat to information integrity. For others, such as, I understand, Mozambique from an article I read earlier this year, it's an opportunity, and we read that Mozambique adopts an AI-powered platform to combat election disinformation. I was proud to work in a groundbreaking cabinet partnership as the UK's Science, Innovation and Technology Secretary with Michelle Donlan during her maternity leave this year, and I thank the CPA for their good wishes on that point. During that time, I set the foundations for UK government policy, which will be critical for years to come. I took the decision that our global summit on AI safety in November at Bletchley Park should go ahead, and I set its direction and outcomes. I recruited the chair of the then Frontier AI Task Force. I established governance and accountability inside government on AI and cohered the approach across all departments, reviewing the potential risks as well as the national security implications of AGI. So I hope I might be able to contribute to considerations at this conference by setting out a little bit of how the government here is approaching AI. And I'll come on specifically to electoral policy, having, as James kindly mentioned, also held the office across a decade of Constitution Minister here in the UK. I'd like to start by setting out why we in the UK think that a principled approach to AI matters. There is certainly opportunity and probably huge risk in this technology. We don't know it all yet, but we suspect that it's going to change everything that we do: education, business, healthcare, defence, and the way that we live. There could be a revolution in the quality and responsiveness of public services if the right calls are made, and that may well include parts of the apparatus that delivers and sustains elections. I do believe that accelerating AI investment, deployment, and capabilities represent enormous opportunities for public good. They bring economic growth, of course, the prospect of up to $7 trillion in growth over the next 10 years. But if there is risk as well as opportunity, we have to prepare for both and ensure against the former. There is not consensus on risks, but they are profound and possible. Combine that point with the speed of change, the possibility that governments are outpaced, and citizens rightly need reassurance. That's why the British government's position is to act before mistakes happen. Safety is going to be the determining factor of success. People must have as much faith in this technology as they do in stepping on an aeroplane. Without safety, there would be no airline industry, and the same is true of AI. The UK government is delivering on that vision through the Frontier AI Task Force, originally chaired by leading tech entrepreneur Ian Hogarth, and now evolving into the AI Safety Institute. This is the first state-backed organisation to focus on advancing AI safety for the public interest. Its mission is to minimise surprise to the UK and to humanity from rapid and unexpected advances in AI. It will work towards this by developing the socio-technical infrastructure needed to understand the risks of advanced AI and to enable its governance. We held the Global AI Safety Summit in November with other Commonwealth partners, of course, for example, Australia, Canada, India, Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Singapore. It was a generational moment, underpinned by the landmark Bletchley Declaration, in which we convened the world's leading powers to agree a shared understanding of the risks and opportunities of future frontier AI and the need to collaborate further to address them. Building on this, the discussions during the summit brought together a small but expert group of governments, businesses, and leading thinkers from academia and civil society to navigate a new course for AI safety. It explicitly examined elections under work on risks from the integration of frontier AI into society, such as election disruption, bias, impacts on crime and online safety, and exacerbating global inequalities. Rightly, the conversation will be continuing thereafter to be inclusive and to be more wide than only focusing on frontier AI. The technology, of course, doesn't follow national boundaries, so any meaningful global agreements must extend, in the end, to all countries. And indeed, this does not only come down to countries or companies that are keen and transparent. Malign actors need to be taken seriously. If we want safety in an open source world, we're going to have to deal widely. AI can and should be a tool for all. Yet any technology that can be used by all can also be used for ill. In most countries that have elections next year, there will be parties, movements, or forces that seek to use technology to secure their own goals. This will not always be pretty. It will be a complex and probably confusing picture. Every country, every company, every party, every user, and every citizen has their own role to play in maintaining integrity. In the UK, we'll be using regulation to achieve the next layer of protection against the risks of AI and to nurture the opportunities for citizens. As you might know from the government's white paper, we've set out the approach here in the UK of tasking existing regulators to oversee the applications of AI in their spheres. Our framework is underpinned by 5 principles to guide and inform the responsible development and use of AI in all sectors of the economy. Those principles being safety, security, robustness, appropriate transparency and explainability, and of course, fairness. The approach overall recognises that particular AI technologies can be applied in many different ways, and this means the risks can vary hugely. The philosophy is to support innovation while providing a framework to ensure that risks are identified and addressed. Rather than target specific technologies, it focuses on the context in which AI is deployed. I think that will be a proportionate and more agile framework. I'd be worried that a heavy-handed or more rigid approach would risk being stifling and too slow. It will be a big ask for regulators, but that work is already underway and being coordinated through the Science Department, along with a central risk function to help scan the horizon. I now use electoral regulation as an example within this framework. As I say, I know it well from 10 years of professional focus on it. Many of us at this conference will also know it well as practitioners. I offer two thoughts. The first is that certainly in UK law, the core offences, the crimes, exist already. Our elections law is robust, we're fortunate for that, and most evils are already legislated for. But the second point is that speed and volume will go up with AI, of course. That means we need to look at enforcement capacity, including in our regulator, the Electoral Commission, and in local police forces. Other countries represented here today and through the CPA will have a similar challenge, I suspect. Some will also have the more profound challenge of neither capacity nor mature capability in running elections. Parliament here is watching closely and asking some big questions. AI is a challenge for legislators around the world because legislature's processes are slow and this technology is fast. I would hope that nations can work together using processes like the summit, but also the foundation of good work by the United Nations, by the Global Partnership on AI and the OECD. I think the Commonwealth and the CPA has an important role here. As we know, the CPA is one of the oldest established organisations in the Commonwealth. Your goal of bringing together members, irrespective of gender, race, religion or culture, who are united by community of interest, respect for the rule of law and individual rights and freedoms, and by the pursuits of the positive ideals of parliamentary democracy, is as essential as it has ever been. You do offer a great opportunity to collaborate on issues of mutual interest and to share good practice. Your recent handbook on these issues is excellent. So you're showing how that the work of the CPA is as applicable to democracy itself as indeed it should be to other aspects of technology as well. I also believe that parliamentarians specifically have an important role. I regard our system as combining three roles into a fabulous job. We MPs are local champions in our constituencies, we're national lawmakers, and we are ambassadors for democracy. I'll take each of those by turn. As local champions, we know our constituents, and we are held accountable for much of their experience of the economy or of public services. Given the widespread risks and opportunities of AI, this is a significant listening role. As national lawmakers, we are the ones who need to confront a fast new technology and be able to make intelligent provision in our law or our regulation. And thirdly, as ambassadors for democracy, it is us who need to be able to be confident that our democracies are robust and that people's free choices achieve what they intend. I'll draw to a conclusion with two thoughts from others. The first comes from a series of articles dated the 31st of August this year from The Economist. How worried should the 4 billion collective population of states voting next year be about AI? Not so much as you might think, they conclude, because, and I quote, people are not angels and elections have never been free from falsehoods and mistaken beliefs. I think Heidi's presentation reminded us pretty clearly of that. Now, we may well get more of it, we'll get greater cacophony, but people have always been, again I quote, quite capable of transmitting all manner of destructive ideas to each other. Voters are hard to persuade, says this magazine. The writer poses the excellent thought experiment. What deepfake would truly change your choice and the choice of millions of already committed US voters between Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump. You can take that one up with the editor. My final provocation of thought is borrowed from sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson, who said in 2009, which is of course way before ChatGPT anyway, and he said this: the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. My conclusion? We who have the privilege to work in the institution of democracy have a special duty to keep it fit for today. We should ensure that we have the right personal and professional skills to properly discharge our generation's duty to address the risk and opportunity of AI. We should remain ambassadors for democracy, always acting with integrity and playing our part in upholding people's right to freely choose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Right Honourable Smith, for that, for those opening remarks. And yeah, I absolutely love how you finished on some provocative thoughts, but also provoking attending parliamentarians into undertaking their duties. Absolutely. And yeah, absolutely agree that we heard from Heidi about how destructive ideas have always influenced elections, but it's the speed and scale now. And yeah, very fun thought experiment in terms of what deepfake will actually inspire you to move your vote. So all very provocative. We like provocative opening remarks. I think it gets the thoughts flowing, and I'm sure the Q&A and also the chat function will be full of people sharing their own ideas. So thank you very much again, Right Honourable Smith. I think our attendees got a lot from that, and like I said, I think it's a great primer for the wider conference. So thank you so much. I see that we already have our 3 panelists for our next session, so I think we're going to continue moving quite swiftly through the programme. We're joined by 3 outstanding speakers, some of whom I've had the privilege of listening to previously, some of whom are new to me, and one of whom actually delivered the handbook that Chloe mentioned as being outstanding, I think was the word. So yeah, we're delighted with those kind of words and very kind early words. So yeah, this is the session now on generative AI and synthetic media, present and future perspectives. This session will aim to provide attendees with an appreciation of the current capabilities of generative artificial intelligence and its ability to generate content and media at speed and scale, as well as the potential trajectory of these technologies. The session will also encourage attendees to consider AI through an ethical lens and to start to think about what ethical AI might look like in practice. I think there might be a few pieces of terminology in this session that will be new to attendees, but I'm sure that over the course of these conversations, these will start to become clearer and clearer. And hopefully the poll that you all answered at the start of today's schedule and the poll that you'll answer at the end will know whether those terms managed to come across. So we're going to start with a number of presentations, one from each of our distinguished panelists. And we're going to start with Dr. Carolyn Ashurst. Carolyn is a Turing Research Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, where her work is motivated by the question, how do we ensure AI and other digital technologies are researched, developed and used responsibly? Carolyn also works to convene technical, policy and domain experts, for example, to ensure that regulators have access to necessary technical expertise. So very pertinent to our conversations. She has facilitated discussions between various communities through workshops co-organised with the ICO, the NICE and CDI. She also sits on a range of advisory boards and working groups, and previously worked as a senior researcher scholar at Oxford and as a data and research scientist in various roles, both within government and finance. And she holds a PhD in mathematics from the University of Bath. So Carolyn, delighted to have you join us, and I'll hand over the microphone to yourself.
Thank you so much, James. So for my opening remarks, I'm going to attempt to give a very, very short introduction to foundation models. So I'm going to aim to very briefly tell you a little bit about what they are, what are some of their uses, their impacts and their risks, and close with some very high level thoughts on what do we need to do to ensure that they are used to help rather than harm society. So firstly, what are foundation models? So I'm going to start by talking about language models. So language models have been around for a long time, a very high level. They typically attempt to learn patterns of language. So for example, by looking at example training data, they learn what word likely comes next in a sentence given the words that come before. So these language models can be used for a range of tasks, things like automatic translation, translating between English and French, say, and also in tools such as those for transcribing audio for subtitles, for example. So while language models have been around for a very long time, the introduction of so-called neural networks, deep learning, and most recently transformer architectures you may have heard of, have resulted in a sort of step change in performance of these models. And we're now in the era of so-called large language models. So what we typically mean by this, so again, we're still in the realm of learning patterns in data, what word comes next, given that I've observed lots of text previously. But these large language models are characterized by learning this discourse information based on very, very large data sets. So typically billions of words, often scraped from the internet, because that's the only place you can get so much text data for training. They're also characterized by a large number of parameters, and by this we simply mean that they can store a lot of information, which allows them to learn very detailed patterns within language. And they're also characterized by large compute costs. So state-of-the-art models might cost millions of pounds to train, for example. So we have these large language models, and more recently people have started to use the term foundation models. I believe this term was coined by a team at Stanford, and they wanted to get across the idea that there's a trend at the moment for starting by training a very generic large language model, if we're in the world of languages, based on whatever text you can sort of get your hands on, to learn a very general model of language. And then you can use that as an application, as a foundation, to build lots of different types of application. So you might start off with that foundation model, but then through some further training and by developing the software application on top of that, you might build an application for a medical context or a legal context or a customer service context, etc. So while I'm talking about language models, you also get foundation models to generate all sorts of media, be that images or code or video, music, scientific models, all sorts of things. And we're likely to see more stuff in the sort of multimedia, multimodal space in coming months. So so now to what are some of their uses? So thinking about language, what we've seen recently is that these models have really come on in their conversational aspect. So ChatGPT, as I'm sure has been mentioned already today. And this conversational aspect and this fluency of question and answering obviously lends itself to lots of different spaces, such as customer service or answering medical queries, etc. They can also be used as very general language tools, for example, to summarize documents or lots of documents, or to change the style of a piece of writing. More creatively, they can also be used for generating ideas on a small or a large scale. And they can also be used for finding information. So we're seeing a lot of investment in incorporating these into search tools. So you can imagine moving further into a world where, like internet search that we have at the moment, you might have something similar, but more sophisticated, more back and forth, for example, more personalization, maybe. And we're likely to see a lot of investment of these things in things like virtual assistants and various software tools like email. So again, because a lot of these tasks are very, very broadly applicable, things like answering questions, finding information, that's why we should expect and have already seen a lot of interest in very different domains. throughout areas that affect people's personal and professional lives. And there'll be even more things to come with other types of media. So now to limitations. So again, while these things are very impressive in what they can do, at the heart, they are learning patterns within language. They don't have the same sort of ways of understanding as you and I have when we have a conversation. And it can be very easy to forget that when you're having a very fluent conversation. But because they don't have this same sort of understanding, they're very prone to producing text that is incorrect. So you've probably heard about hallucinations, by which we mean generating text which is very plausible and convincing, but is utterly false information. Another limitation is their so-called black box nature. These things, because of how they're built and because of their scale, they can be challenging and time-consuming to understand what they have learnt and to evaluate them. And they often exhibit surprising behaviour, sometimes for good, unfortunately, often for ill. So now to broader societal concerns. So this is a huge topic. So just to give a very quick flavour. So as you can imagine, this tendency to generate inaccurate content could have all sorts of harms. It's easy to imagine how in a medical context, giving incorrect information could be very detrimental. But there are other types of harmful content as well. This includes generating toxic content, harmfully stereotypical content, etc. And it's worth bearing in mind that the text that these models are trained on represents a very skewed view of the world. Only certain voices are represented in this training data set. And of course, things like misinformation campaigns and cybersecurity threats could be enabled or scaled up through these sorts of technologies. There's also a lot of concerns to do with the supply chain of these models. So these include things like the environmental impacts of these huge training costs, concerns around the data that is used for training, whether there is adequate consent, etc., particularly when this data is taken from the internet. And there's a lot of concern as well for the treatment of data workers who are used in the training pipeline. Working conditions for those data workers are often pretty poor in many ways. For example, poor pay, etc. And some people make the point that there's the outsourcing of harms going on, whereby the big financial benefits are going to certain players in certain parts of the world. But for example, these negative impacts on these low-paid jobs and working conditions, etc., is being outsourced to other places on the globe. Looking further afield, there's lots of concerns about impacts to jobs, whether this could mean unemployment in certain sectors, or perhaps in the nearer term, what will happen to the quality of work in different sectors due to these models. So lots of questions and some very broad question about who will benefit basically from these models, particularly if we end up in a situation with very large dependencies on a small number of firms who have the very best models. And of course, as we've heard and as we know, these developments are happening really, really fast, a lot of investment, so we don't expect that to slow down. And this makes it very difficult for regulators to keep up, but also for best practice around responsible development and deployment to keep up. So to conclude, I'll just mention some very high-level thoughts about what do we need to do in response. So firstly, as I said, we really need to figure out collaboratively this best practice for responsible development and deployment, and eventually think about how to tie this to regulation. So one effort that I've been involved in is the Partnership on AI's development of guidance for foundation model developers. And I'll post a link in the chat shortly. This guidance has just been put out for public comment, so I'd really love to hear from lots of people about what you think about this, particularly as we're keen to get a global perspective. What else do we need? We need a pushback against tech firms defining the debate, for example, defining what oversight should look like and defining what harms should be focused on. We need a wider set of voices included in these conversations. And by that, I mean from more countries, more organisation, and in particular from those who can represent those who typically don't get a seat at the table, be that children, the elderly, socially disadvantaged, and again, this more global perspective, particularly with these very global issues like to do with outsourcing of harms, etc. And finally, we need the resources to do this work, to understand and mitigate the harms. And we need to do this, but without sort of doing big tech's work for them, I believe. So thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. A number of really, really interesting points that you've raised. I have some questions of my own about, you mentioned some of the conversational aspects of large language models and also this idea of generating ideas through the AI. So maybe some of my questions during the roundtable discussion will be on that, and also really interesting to hear you talk about pushing back against the narrative that some of the larger firms have tried to establish. And I know that there was that open letter that I think was signed by many of the large firms that had that head start, suggesting that there be a pause, and some interpreted that as trying to maintain that head start. So yeah, that immediately reminded me of that. But yeah, thank you so much for that really helpful overview of foundational models, and I'm sure there are a number of questions percolating in people's minds. I'm now going to pass on to our second speaker, Cassidy Bereskin. Cassidy is a DPhil student and Clarendon scholar researching the efficacy of content disclosure and provenance interventions for tackling deceptive synthetic media and disinformation. I did promise attendees there would be terms that you might not be familiar with, and maybe some of those fall into that category. But I know that Cassidy is very good at explain them in an accessible way. She is the founder and director of Oxgen AI, a company that hosts the Oxford Generative AI Summit, a multi-stakeholder expert convention on generative AI and society. Previously, she conducted research as part of the Alan Turing Institute's online safety team and worked on the COVID-19 Monitor, Canada's largest public opinion study on the pandemic. She holds an MSc in social science of the internet from the Oxford Internet Institute, where she graduated with distinction, and a BA in political science from McMaster University, where she graduated as valedictorian. So Cassidy, I'll hand over the microphone to yourself.
Thanks so much, James. It's such an honor to be speaking at such a timely and important conference. Thank you, James, Jack, and the CPA for the opportunity to be on this brilliant panel with Carolyn and Tommy, and really enjoyed the speech and thinking about demystifying foundation models and all the news that we're seeing breaking every moment, and trying to really make sense of the concepts that at play. And I'll try to do something similar when it comes to synthetic disinformation, trying to demystify that and think about synthetic media, synthetic disinformation, misinformation, deepfakes. A lot of these terms have become really prominent in the last couple years and months, particularly. So to give an overview of my speech, I'm going to start by contextualizing synthetic media more broadly, providing a definition of that, thinking about some examples from 2023, and then getting into disinformation, misinformation, synthetic disinformation, deepfakes, and then dive into some of the new features and risks that this emergent form of disinformation poses, and finally thinking about some of the implications and downstream effects. So in her 2020 book, Deepfakes, generative AI expert Nina Schick warned that soon anyone with a smartphone will be able to produce Hollywood-level special effects at next to no cost with minimum skill or effort. She predicted that in 2020, and in 2023, it's proving increasingly prescient with the proliferation of synthetic media on social media and on the internet at large. So what is synthetic media? It's a broader umbrella term, and I think a really coherent and comprehensive definition is laid out in a framework that was produced by the Partnership on AI's. It's called the Partnership on AI's Responsible Practices for Synthetic Media, where they refer to it as visual, auditory, or multimodal content that has been generated or modified, commonly via artificial intelligence. Such outputs are often highly realistic, would not be identifiable as synthetic to the average person, and may simulate artifacts, persons, or events. So that's pretty elaborate and a lot going on there. When it comes to visual, auditory, or multimodal, what they refer to is visual content. So it could be an image or photograph, auditory, so somebody's voice or speech, and multimodal could be a combination of it could be text and image, text and audio, or speech and video as well. So you could have multiple combinations there. And it's a broad term that encompasses many different types of AI generated content, with there being, as we've seen, a lot of exciting and really positive use cases of synthetic media, but also a profoundly darker side, which is what I explore in the handbook on synthetic media, AI, and disinformation, which I was really grateful for the opportunity to be an author of, and enjoyed working on that over the last couple of months. So that's the broad definition. Over the past year, we've seen really a constellation of examples of viral synthetic media. For instance, in April 2023, a viral AI-generated image of Pope Francis in a white puffer jacket was described as the first real mass-level AI misinformation case, just given how extremely realistic that image was, that many of you have seen, and that's in the handbook as well. A month later, we saw the image falsely depicting an explosion at the Pentagon, which briefly impacted the stock market. Fast forward to this past October, we've seen a viral deepfake audio clip featuring Keir Starmer, who's the leader of the UK's Labour Party, allegedly berating staffers in that audio clip, which quickly gathered 1.5 million hits and was characterized in the news as the UK's first deepfake moment. Similarly, not too long later, around the election in Slovakia, there was a deepfake audio clip of Michal Šimečka, who's the leader of the Progressive Slovakia Party, appearing to be discussing election rigging with a prominent journalist. We've seen in recent weeks, there was an Indian actress, Rashmika Mandanna, who expressed alarm about a deepfake which had her face superimposed onto someone else's body, going viral and raising a lot of concerns. So when it comes to synthetic media, can be used for good, but can also be really weaponized to spread disinformation and misinformation. And let's get into some of those terms. So when it comes to disinformation, a really well-documented definition that was put forward by a researcher, Claire Wardle, in 2017, is effectively saying that disinformation refers to the intentional creation and or sharing of false or misleading content. So really with the underlying purpose that animates that being the intent to deceive, whereas misinformation is maybe false and misleading, but it's not necessarily spread with the intention of deceiving people and causing harm. These terms are often distinguished in a huge body of literature over the last decade or so. But it is still worth noting that something can start as a disinformation narrative, the intention behind putting it on social media as disinformation, and then it kind of proliferates and can be shared by people who don't necessarily intend to deceive, but are seeing this content and are under an erroneous belief in its veracity. So when it comes to synthetic, bringing the disinformation and synthetic media together, a term that I use and propose in the handbook, and that has started to be used in academic literature, is synthetic disinformation, where I refer to it as disinformation that's generated and or enhanced via synthetic media techniques. And there's a variety of techniques and underlying technical tools that you can use to generate different kinds of synthetic media. So also kind of a broad definition, but includes that essential element of there's an underlying intent to deceive here. And maybe when it's spread and shared throughout the internet, it loses that, but the origin is clearly malicious in that sense. Deepfakes, another term that has become really prominent. I describe it as synthetic media, or a subset of synthetic media that uses deep learning, subset of machine learning, to generate realistic videos, audio, and or images where people are appearing to say or perform actions that they've never done before. So it can be deceptive, it can be weaponized, and clearly cause a lot of damage reputationally and to democracies, which I'll touch on, but also could be used more for entertainment, or if somebody consents to their likeness being deep faked, then it could be them maybe in an advert or some other kind of context. So it's not necessarily invariably disinformation, but it can certainly be weaponized at scale. So when it comes to synthetic disinformation, okay, disinformation itself has been around for centuries. Online disinformation has been around for decades. Synthetic disinformation, why should we really care about it? Why should we really have a new term for it? In the handbook, I break it down into a couple different features. It's not necessarily that it's completely new, but there's some features here that are distinct from what we've seen in the past. One is accessibility and efficiency, whereby advancements in generative AI and synthetic media have really kind of democratized the production and dissemination of this content, where it's accessible now to a wider range of people and organizations. And I guess you can have these, it used to previously be people with a lot of resources, programmers, and now it's really anyone that can access them by using tools like OpenAI's GPT-4, DALL-E 2 or 3 now, etc. So it's a lot more accessible. It's hyper realistic in a way where we haven't seen in the past. And now the adage that seeing is believing, seeing is no longer believing. We have to really think critically about the kind of lifelike depictions of events, people, and artifacts that are now a lot harder to spot as compared to more crudely edited, kind of clearly photoshopped things that we've seen in the past. When it comes to the third factor of scalability, whereby generative AI really enables the mass production and scaling of disinformation, which can amplify its reach and potential impact. And personalization and hyper-targeting is another thing that's pretty distinct, where synthetic media can really be hyper-targeted or made persuasive and personalized to a particular audience segment, which is very concerning. From what my research, I've seen a lot of articles finding that disinformation often preaches to the converted, and this could be problematic because if it is explained by something like confirmation bias or motivated reasoning, where people tend to favor information that reinforces their pre-existing beliefs, when disinformation is personalized, it's concerning because it might really entrench, harden, maybe fortify pre-existing beliefs, and maybe deepen ideological divides. I say maybe because as a researcher, you can't necessarily research the future, and we'll have to see as the empirical evidence comes out and can really be tracking the developments that emerge. But thinking about past research and the trends we're seeing, it's incredibly alarming. And the other feature that's distinct is a term called the liar's dividend, which some of you might have come across, coined by Danielle Citron and Bobby Chesney to refer to the phenomenon where malicious actors can weaponize citizen skepticism, kind of this broad public skepticism around, oh, this could be a deep fake, that could be a deep fake, we don't know anymore what is real and what isn't, to kind of to weaponize that and discredit genuine evidence, which can help them to protect their own credibility. And as they write in their article proposing the concept that, put simply, a skeptical public will be primed to doubt the authenticity of real audio and video evidence. So from the perspective of kind of public trust, in visual evidence, we see that it may be very much eroded by all these new developments. So ultimately, just to wrap up, synthetic media, it muddies the waters in the sense of posing at least two very clear threats. So kind of twin threats. On the one hand, synthetic disinformation in itself can be extremely damaging, such as by damaging people's reputations and eroding citizens' abilities to make truly informed decisions about who to trust, what to believe, who to vote for, and ultimately threatening to undermine the integrity of democratic processes. And the second overarching threat is that it can have the effect of kind of sowing doubt and cynicism and undermining trust with these actors dismissing authentic information as synthetic, and that can contribute to a sort of erosion of our collective sense of reality. I'll finish with just a quote from a computer science professor, Hani Farid, who recently contributed to an article in the New York Times where he wrote that I thought it was an interesting quote, which is that the specter of deepfakes is much, much more significant now. It doesn't take tens of thousands, it takes a few, and then you poison the well and everything becomes suspect. So I thought that really encapsulates the concerns around the liar's dividend. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully that was I was able to demystify those concepts, and happy to take any questions and looking forward to participating in the roundtable as well.
Great, thank you so much, Cassidy. I think all of those topics, all of those ideas are super relevant to democracy. I think, yeah, really important distinction between mis and disinformation. I think we often, maybe there are more actors in the misinformation when it's unwitting. I think this idea of what are sometimes called echo chambers and preaching to the converted and motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, I think really speaks to what Chloe Smith spoke about in her thought experiment that she posed, that said, would deepfakes really motivate you to move your vote? Well, maybe they'll motivate you to become even more entrenched in the vote that you're already planning to assign. And yeah, also the liar's dividend, which I think is hugely important in terms of public discourse. This isn't only about deepfakes creating the fake, but also discrediting the true. And certainly one of the key motivations for the handbook was this idea of losing that anchor of objective truth and agreeing on what is reality. So hopefully that's also gotten people's thoughts motivated, seeing plenty of questions coming in, which we love to see. So yeah, thank you again, Cassidy. And we'll move on to our third and final presentation by Tommy Chaffershane. Tommy is an expert on AI safety and develops policies to address risks from AI based on his academic research, policy work in the UK government, and experience developing multiple AI products. He is currently AI policy advisor at the Centre for Long-Term Resilience, a UK-based think tank focused on the long-term resilience of society. Previously, he was head of AI and disinformation policy at the UK government, where he led a development of policies to counter AI-enabled disinformation and the development of a £10 million AI platform that analyses online disinformation. Prior to that, Tommy was head of policy at First Draft, a counter-disinformation non-profit, where he collaborated with the World Health Organization, Stanford University, UNICEF, UN, Google, and the Partnership on AI, so just a few small players. Tommy is currently completing a PhD on AI safety incidents, looking at how they can inform the future of AI. So Tommy, absolutely delighted to have you join us, and I'll hand over the microphone to yourself.
Thanks so much. And yeah, great to hear everyone who's gone before. I think I'm going to touch on some similar points, Cassidy, which maybe we can kind of refer to in the roundtable after my presentation. But it's great to be here. As you mentioned, James, I've recently joined the Centre for Long-Term Resilience. So we're a UK-based think tank. But previous to that, I led disinformation and AI policy at the UK government. So I did a lot of work with teams looking to operationally respond to things like deepfakes as they arose, as well as thinking about policies that we might need in order to address them. So I can kind of want to just draw on some of that experience that we've had in those contexts, to kind of talk a bit about what we can do about some of this problem. So I think Casti really kind of elegantly set out the risks of this technology and Caroline the capabilities. I'm going to just turn a little bit to kind of some of the options for what we can do. Now, the first point I want to make is that the governance of the major AI developers, so OpenAI, Meta, Anthropic, these kind of big players, that's not really going to be enough to solve the problem that AI poses for disinformation. So though it's kind of clear by now that we do need global standards for the safe development of AI, and that's going to probably involve some kind of mix between kind of existing regulators, maybe some new functions, such as the one that we've set up here in the UK, the AI Safety Institute, and its kind of sister organization in the United States. We're going to need some kind of combination like that, and we're going to need the right types of testing, transparency, risk governance, ethical norms, and so on in these big AI companies. And there's no doubt about that. And what we kind of need to do is figure out exactly what that looks like, and do that as quickly as we can. But the problem for disinformation is that many of these safeguards will not be relevant. And the first reason for this is the what's known as open source models, which are kind of AI tools that are shared publicly for free on the internet. They often lack the safety features that those kind of bigger AI companies build into their models. And that risks misuse by disinformation actors, like the ones we've been talking about. And if they're not there, sometimes they are in those models, but they can easily be removed. And so all of those kind of mechanisms that are dominating the debate at the moment, they're not necessarily going to apply to a lot of the tools that certain actors are going to be using. Now, the second problem is that even just putting that kind of open source problem to one side, state actors have the resource to develop their own foundation models, or to kind of fine tune, further develop their own kind of open source models. And they, again, they're not going to be regulated by, regulators, safety institutes, and so on. And these kinds of actors essentially have the tools they need to propagate disinformation, and our kind of conventional regulation isn't going to do much to stop it. So what do we do in that context? Well, I think, Casti, you kind of touched on some points about, needing to be quite specific about what problem AI poses for disinformation. So as you said, disinformation has existed for quite a long time, in terms of kind of the contemporary, the kind of modern forms of disinformation, that's been decades that campaigns have looked at it to manipulate the media, the news, use the available communication channels to kind of deceive and to manipulate. The ability to manipulate images and videos, that's existed for a long time. Photoshop exists. And one of the things that lots of people have been pointing to is the existence of so-called cheap fakes, which is just really cheaply edited videos and images. So that's not new. We've been able to do that for a long time. And disinformation actors can also produce lots of content. So, and they can do it quite cheaply. And the reason that they can do that is you can use people. So people can write lots of tweets, different social media posts, doesn't have to cost that much money. So we can already do quite big volumes of content. And while this becomes easier with AI, these are kind of those kinds of problems. They're largely efficiency savings, and they're still a little bit speculative. We don't know quite how effective AI is at writing really compelling tweets. So it's efficiency savings rather than kind of major capability shifts. Excuse me. So I think what we need is a more precise account of AI's role, and what it's actually, the problems it's actually going to bring about, in order that we can kind of identify relevant solutions. And I think, exactly as has kind of been touched upon so far, the kind of big concern is the greater access to these activities and the types of people that can engage in them. So that's not just kind of hostile state actors, as it has typically been in the past, but kind of smaller dark PR firms. So these are kind of agencies that will try and manipulate people online for money. You've also got political parties that are increasingly using these tools, and they're kind of just are a cheap way of creating a campaign content by all sorts of different actors associated with political parties during campaigns. And then you also have lone individuals. So someone just kind of creating something because it's fun. They don't necessarily care that much about the impact, but it could potentially cause a lot of mayhem. And what this means is that there will just be a lot more fake audiovisual content online. And as a result, people's relationship with audiovisual content is going to change, because essentially it's going to become a lot less believable. So previously, if you saw something that looked exactly like a photorealistic image, you're not going to be able to believe that quite in the same way. And as we touched upon before about the kind of lies dividend, people can therefore reject real documentation and say it wasn't real. It's also a problem for lots of institutions. So law enforcement, the way that it relies on evidence, whether it can ID victims in the same way. You've got problems in the courts, intelligence gathering processes. For all of these actors, it's going to be very hard to know if what you're seeing or hearing is real. It's not necessarily the case that, this one single deepfake is going to shift the election. And I think it's important that we kind of become sober about what the risks are, and also become precise about them in order to address them. So I think what follows from this is that we need ways to prove that media is real. Now, we can't kind of rely just by looking if something looks real anymore. We're going to have to kind of have different cues, different ways of understanding what is what we're actually looking at online. And I think part of this will rely on kind of labels and the kinds of tools that I think it sounds like, Casti, you're kind of looking at in some of your research. It'd be great to kind of hear more about your work on that. Now, I want to kind of just provide a warning first of all on this type of technology, which is that quite a lot of hope tends to be invested in deepfake detection. So this is kind of like a tool that can assess deepfakes and say whether they think it's real or not real. And this is quite a tantalizing and attractive solution. It seems that it would kind of solve the problem if it worked. But what we've found is that in practice, detection doesn't help that much. And one of the key reasons for this is that a detection tool tends to only work in probabilities. So what that means is that it will say that there's maybe an 80% chance that a video is real or has been deepfaked. And it's quite difficult to take decisions on the basis of uncertainty like this. So let me just kind of go to an example here. One of the deepfakes that was quite publicized this year was of Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, which you touched upon, Casti. Now that video was not taken down. That video, it was an audio clip, but in the form of a video. Twitter did not take it down. Fact checkers could not conclusively demonstrate that it wasn't real. It doesn't seem like it's real. There are various reasons why it seems unlikely that it is real. But nonetheless, that couldn't be conclusively proved. And even as deepfake detection tools improve, they're always going to be working on the basis of probabilities. And on that basis, we can't rely on kind of these detection tools to kind of solve these problems for us. But this is the kind of area we need to kind of make some progress on. And I think what we really need to grapple with it is what tools we can develop so that people can make informed judgments about what is real online. And this will partly rely on being able to prove when media is real. So, for example, proving where and when a video or a photograph was taken, some kind of guarantee that it was actually a photo of that time and place and not generated by AI. It will also require using things like watermarks to know when images and videos have been AI generated. And this is likely to be a part of the future of the internet, some kinds of guarantees that you can see. It won't apply to everything you see online, but there will be some kind of assurances for where it is possible. But we are really struggling to get there. It's going to require quite a lot of industry collaboration. These tools have to talk to each other. Facebook has to accept something that was originally posted on Twitter, and they need to kind of be interoperable. And there's a lot of kind of collaboration that is yet to really kind of make big progress as far as we're seeing at the moment. And one of the other things we need to do is, with all of these technologies, really make sure that access is equitable. So there's not just some people in some parts of the world that are able to kind of use these technologies to create these kind of guarantees, but there is equitable access, so that we don't end up creating kind of new problems based on these kind of technologies. But I think kind of, and where I'll close is that we need to, the more precise that we can be about the problems we're worried about, and I think moving beyond a bit of the hysteria that tends to dominate the news about, a prime minister just denouncing they're going to quit in a deepfake, the kind of thing that gets actually debunked very quickly. The more we can be precise about what those problems are and what the specific thing is that AI changes, the more we can get targeted solutions, like these kinds of authenticity tools that I've discussed. And thanks very much. I'll hand back. I'm looking forward to the roundtable.
Thank you very much, Tommy. I think, all three presentations have worked really, really well together. I think this emphasis on precision and sobriety are really, really important, and avoid some of the hysteria that we might hear around these technologies. You started to touch upon ways of proving that media is real and some of the challenges that come with that, and whether intentional or not, that's actually a really good trailer for tomorrow's schedule of conversations, where we actually hear from the C2PA actors about their standard that they're trying to push, which does a lot of that kind of work that you mentioned. But I think equitable access is also really important. Having that diversity of voices is really, really key as well. I know there are a number of questions in the Q&A that have been posed. Some are a bit more context specific. Some of them using language even I'm not entirely au fait with, but hopefully we can come to some of those questions. I saw them absolutely flying in during the presentation. Maybe just a sort of starter for 10 from myself to go back to the capabilities of artificial intelligence and where we are right now. We have Carolyn from the Turing Institute, and I've been thinking about the Turing test, or the imitation game, which used to be seen as a bit of a litmus test for human-like intelligence. This idea of can a computer trick somebody into thinking it's a person? Are we there now? Is that an outdated standard or measure? Have we sort of surpassed that now? Especially thinking about things like large language models, and you mentioned already that it's able to be conversational. Do you think the Turing test has now been surpassed, and actually computers are passing themselves off as human?
Or shall I start with that one? So I think for me, so the Turing test, it's an interesting experiment, and people do still run the Turing test. For people who are not aware, the idea is they have a person who's interacting with either a person or a machine. They don't know which, and they have to try and guess. And of course, if you're a human behind the curtain, you try and convince they're a human. If you're a machine behind the curtain, then the hope is that your machine will be so good at conversation that you can convince this person. So I think these tests, they tell you something. They definitely tell you something. They tell you something possibly about fluency, but certainly about how convincing the models might be, or certainly at least they tell you something about human perception and human trust, and human psychology. And these are very interesting and important things for us to understand. Generally, though, this isn't how we tend to evaluate models these days. Instead, the trend is towards producing various benchmarks that try and test all sorts of different capabilities. At the moment, there's a trend towards, for example, for text-based models, can your model pass certain exams, like legal exams, for example, or medical exams, or maths competitions, for example, or coding competitions, things like that. And each of these will tell you something about the capabilities of your model. I think there's a little bit of a there's this trend where while these tests are out of reach, things like when the Turing test was very this would be a very, very far distant thing, back in the 50s when it was determined. It's very easy to assume that in order to pass something like the Turing test, you would have to have a model with very general understanding and build a model of the world and things like that. And as we've seen with various tests, and chess was another one, we used to think that in order to solve chess, you'd have to have creativity and intuition and a very good model of your opponent in the world and things like that. It turns out that you can often pass these tests through quite systematic behavior. Chess, you do a big search, essentially. You sort of systematically step forward and evaluate, and that you don't need any of these kind of human-like ways of thinking. And again, with the Turing test, even a few decades ago, even with some quite clever ways of manipulating how people think with certain responses, you could convince people maybe there was a human in the box. So these things that we used to think maybe would be telling you about human-like intelligence, not necessarily the case. So while I'd say we're at a point where models can be very, very language models can be very convincing, we need to be careful not to infer too much about what that means about their sort of underlying capability and level of intelligence.
Thank you very much, Karen. I don't know if Cassidy or Tommy want to come in on this point at all. Yeah, sure, Tommy, go for it.
I mean, I was just going to say, as a kind of a provocation, I guess one of the questions for AI's capabilities would be, can AI convince someone else that they're you? So could AI kind of impersonate you, even visually, and with the content that that kind of sounds like you, is the type of thing that you would say. And I think that I say that not because it would be a robust evaluation of where we are with AI, but as a way of kind of pointing to the loss of control that individuals will soon experience over their likeness. And this is like a very kind of new problem for us to deal with. It's similar to the problem of not being able to trust the veracity of something that is photorealistic. So that's never really been the case before. You could pretty much guarantee that something was real. If it looked like a real photo, it would be a real photo. And similarly, if you see someone, that you can kind of rely on that person actually being them. And I think that some of these kind of assumptions will have to change as AI gets to those points. So they're kind of other, I suppose, benchmarks for us to be kind of mindful of as they approach.
Love the amount of provocation. I like the use of the word provocation. We've had multiple times now. Yeah. How frightening a thought that AI could convince you that it is you. Yeah, very interesting. And Tommy, just to stay with you, I did see there was a question about, and I think it spoke to you discussing new ways to prove media as real, detection tools, some kind of guarantee, and somebody did put in the Q&A I think it was as you were mentioning these matters, they say there is a discourse on developing watermarks or labeling of synthetic media. Do you think it is likely to become an enforced legal standard anytime soon? And maybe I'll spin off that back of that question and say, is this an area where the law needs to get involved? Do you see that big players in the market will be able and willing to regulate themselves? And really, where that responsibility do you think lies for enforcing standards?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if I've understood correctly, Casti, some of your research touches on this, so you might want to kind of come in on as well. I think, I suppose what I'm seeing is a lack of progress in the industry figuring this out for itself. There are protocols to try and bring this about, but they're not widely adopted. And I suppose the question that policymakers might start to ask is, well, how long do we have to wait for this to kind of emerge organically? And if it's not going to, what role does the government or do governments need to play in bringing it about? There are lots of technical challenges to work through, and there are kind of perhaps some incentives that aren't quite there at the moment to kind of get companies to collaborate properly. So I suppose that it's a bit of a ticking time bomb from the perspective that the tech companies potentially in the they can't sit around forever. I don't think that the policymakers will start to get impatient. So they will look to kind of other solutions to make it happen. I do think that there's a lot of momentum, as that kind of the person offering the question has said, around watermarking. There are lots of questions about how you do this in practice. How easy is it to remove a watermark? And one of the really tricky problems here is that there's something called the implied truth effect, which is that if lots of things are labeled as true or false, it implies things that aren't labeled potentially are the opposite. And so if you have a system where only some things are labeled, what kind of media ecosystem are you looking at? So I do think there are some kind of some really difficult problems to work through, but the question is, where is the pressure going to come from in order to kind of cut through some of these knots? And I wonder whether, in the end, that will come from the government.
Yeah, thanks for me. I think in that implied truth effect thing as well, there's a large amount of power being given to those who do create that ecosystem of having a label being true or not being true. Yeah, Cassidy, I don't know if you wanted to also come in on this.
Yeah, those are really interesting points. I definitely agree when it comes to the machine learning efforts to try to detect and classify this content. A lot of false positives, and it's been tricky on the technical side. I've become, over the last 2 years, extremely fascinated and impressed by the work of the C2PA and other companies, organizations. It's a mix of, it's led by industry, with Adobe taking a leading role, but also the BBC, I believe, is involved. And the C2PA content credentials is a technical standard that is advocating for the embedding of metadata into either at the hardware or software level to really develop and formalize a kind of nutrition label for digital media, preserving the metadata of if it's a photo, who took it, where was it taken, how was it altered as it moves through different platforms, and doing that as well for anything that's AI generated to have at creation a file that makes it transparent which model it was when the image was produced, etc. So they tomorrow will speak much more eloquently about it and their work in the ecosystem. But I've been very impressed by it because of this kind of broad collaboration across industry, as well as working with civil society and academia. And I think on that front, what I gather is that the technology is there, and it's quite robust and compelling, but a huge barrier is just adoption. And my research is seeking to understand, what does it look like at the user level when people are seeing a kind of nutrition label for digital media? what factors contribute to making that more effective from the perspective of either reducing susceptibility to disinformation, or improving trust, or improving people's just their ability alone to feel like they've made a more informed decision about what to believe, and exploring that analogy of the nutrition label. What should that really look like, is a question that is kind of guiding my PhD, which now I've just started the second year of. So would certainly curious to hear your thoughts on that. And it's sort of broadly referred to as digital content provenance, with the CTPA taking a lead role, but also right now, I think when it comes to where the regulation is going, and with the executive order from the White House over the last couple weeks ago, and the forthcoming EU AI Act, we're seeing a lot of mention of provenance, of labels, of watermarks, and it's kind of my hunch is that it'll be less standardized until there are both on the technical side, but also on the kind of ecosystem and collaboration side. It has to come from, I think, a multi-stakeholder approach of government and industry and civil society and academia coming together, which may be easier said than done. And maybe I'm more optimistic about it than should be, given all the actors and the complexity and scale. But I think some of these initiatives that are in the works are exciting as a starting point.
Thanks, Cassidy. And maybe I'll hand over to Carolyn. I don't know if you want to come in on this point as well.
No, I don't think I think they've addressed the question very, very eloquently. So I don't really have anything to add other than to say I completely agree. And I'm also heartened to hear about research such as that Cassidy's doing to look at these broader effects of these mechanisms as well, because it's very easy to be quite narrow, and when you're thinking about what the impacts of these technical tools might be. And so I'm really heartened to hear about research that looks to the kind of the broader implications of what those tools might have on the ecosystem.
Great, thank you very much, Carolyn. And maybe I'll just finish with one more question, and then we can move on to our final session for the day. And it speaks a little bit to one of the questions that was in the Q&A as well. I think a lot of the questions are about what can we do about this issue, which is a very broad question. I think we've tried to start answering it throughout the conversations. But quite a few of the presentations spoke about needing a diversity of voices working in AI. And I know that Argo has asked about in the developing world, they're particularly at risk of AI in terms of disinformation. So maybe just a question about, and also sort of black box problem, which can sometimes come from maybe certain biased information being put in and expelling biased outputs as a result of that. So a broad question, but how can we ensure that the world of generative AI is more inclusive, more respectful of diversity of thought, and avoid amplifying existing bias? It's maybe a $1 million question, but maybe Carolyn, I'll put that to yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really important question, and I think there's definitely, as we know, within the tech industry, there's lots of ways in which we don't have diversity of thought. Typically, we do have a lot of developments coming out of a small number of companies in certain parts of the world, and even within those countries, you tend to have particular demographics represented and particular political views represented. So I guess what can we do in response? I think there's a big role for policymakers and government here. I think when it comes to having these conversations about what needs to be done at all levels, from these very sort of high level principle-based conversations that we're having, particularly in the UK, all the way down as we feed through to the specific domains and specific issues. I think we just need to be really conscious of bringing in those voices. And as I hinted at in my opening remarks to really think very critically about this, because there are incentives for tech firms to focus on certain risks and the framing of certain risks, and we've seen that throughout the history of AI ethics, if you like. They are, of course, incentivized to solve certain problems and not others, and therefore, whenever these conversations are happening, think very critically about who's at the table, who should be there, and who can sort of represent those lesser heard voices.
Great, thanks, Karen. And maybe I'll pass on to Tommy as well, to know you mentioned the importance of equitable access and maybe more on how we can ensure that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to introduce good standards for this stuff, and that includes, who is represented on teams, how different people have a voice in certain conversations. It's about how do you kind of build accountability and risk governance into teams? What kinds of transparency do you require? I mean, in a way, it's like it's as if we've kind of just invented an airplane overnight with no understanding of how to run it safely, or even understanding of whether it was built safely. We're really playing catch up to a fast moving technology, and kind of institutionalizing those building norms and standards with whatever kind of legislative support is needed. I think that's a kind of really big first step, and we need to kind of move as quickly as possible there. And I think ideally at every level of development and management, these kind of questions of equity will need to be addressed. But yeah, I think we've got a fairly long way to go. We just need to get there as quickly as we can.
Great, thanks so much, Tommy. And Cassidy, I don't know if you want to have the last word on the last question.
It's a lot of pressure. I think it's been really well answered. I guess the only thing I can perhaps add is just from a research perspective, investing in really good evidence-based research that takes more of an inclusive approach, that works with and looks at contexts that are not maybe as dominant. Currently, I think a lot of the research does focus on the US and UK, at least in my field, when it comes to experimental social science research, and trying to take an approach of doing more research in the global South, taking more of an intersectional approach. And there's a lot of things on the research side that can be done, and investing in that, getting grants and stuff for that would be a good thing to do.
Great, thank you very much, all three. I think that was an excellent conversation. I can see from the amount of questions we got that it really got people thinking. Very kind words from Federico, who said excellent presentations, very clear concepts, congratulations. And Federico, I think you speak on behalf of all the attendees, so I think all that remains for me is to say thank you to all three of you. And we seem to be continually moving swiftly into following sessions, but I think the next session does follow on very nicely, very naturally from these conversations. And to introduce the final session for the day is my colleague Tom Davies. So Tom, I'll hand over the microphone to yourself.
Now we'll be diving into our final session of the day. This is day one of our conference on disinformation, deepfakes and elections. If you're not yet registered for day 2 and day 3, they are separate registrations. So if you're keen to come back tomorrow and on Wednesday, please do go to our website and register there. I know there's been a lot of information so far, a lot of talking. So we're going to start this session with 2 videos for you, and then we're going to come back and introduce the session, and I'll introduce our 3 panelists for this session. Thank you.
There's a lot of talk about the race in 2020. Sure, there's a lot of candidates in the running, but can any of them actually run? I mean, really run? I'm the last American movie star. No one runs like I do, and nobody opens a box office like me. And with your help in 2020, together, we'll dominate the ballot box. This is no stunt. But if it were, I do all those for real. Why vote for me? I'm not just your everyman. I've literally been every man. I've been a Navy pilot, a lawyer, and a Navy lawyer. My opponents will say I was a pimp in high school. It's true. But I grew up fast in NASCAR country and started a small business as a sports agent to set a better example. I know foreign diplomacy because I fought alongside the samurai. And I'm proud to serve our country, defending our planet against aliens twice! No, 3 times. I know this country top to bottom, inside out. From here to here. Because I've lived its history. Literally, I did. As a vampire. I feel the need to lead. As your commander-in-chief, no mission is impossible. So help me help you to elect me in 2020. I'm just a patriot. My birthday? The 4th of July. I'm Tom Cruise and I'm running for President of the United States. America, you complete me. Show me 2020!
This just in, we can now call the 2024 presidential race for Joe Biden.
My fellow Americans. This morning, an emboldened China invades Taiwan.
Financial markets are in free fall as 500 regional banks have shuttered their doors.
Border agents were overrun by a surge of 80,000 illegals yesterday evening.
Officials closed the city of San Francisco this morning, citing the escalating crime and fentanyl crisis.
Who's in charge here? It feels like the train is coming off the tracks.
Welcome back. In this session, we're going to be talking about disinformation, deepfakes, and elections. And we began there with 2 campaign videos from recent elections in the United States. The first election was a parody of the actor Tom Cruise launching a presidential run in 2020. And the second one was a real political advert created by the Republican Party this year ahead of the United States elections in 2024. What's important to stress here is both videos were created entirely using artificial intelligence. Tom Cruise was not involved in the creation of that parody video whatsoever, and none of those dystopian photos that you saw in the political advert have actually been taken by a real photographer. They've all been created by artificial intelligence using computers. So I wanted to start the session by showing you these videos to give you some real examples of what a deepfake looks like. But these are just 2 examples of deepfakes related to political elections. And it's not just in the United States that this is happening. We've already heard of several examples throughout the course of the sessions today where deepfakes have been deployed by individuals or by campaigns during political elections and political cycles. And in this session, we're actually going to hear the stories behind those examples. The previous sessions have been background information and some of the discussion around the thematic areas. Here we want to focus on stories about what actually happens when a deepfake is used in an election or any other type of disinformation that's been AI generated is used. And we're going to look at elections that have taken place in 2023, so recent elections in Turkey, in Slovakia, and in Nigeria. So our panel today, we've got an esteemed panel with recent first-hand experience of election campaigns in the era of artificial intelligence, and their stories are going to examine the practical implications of disinformation and deepfakes for people at the heart of the electoral process. As with previous sessions, please do use the Q&A function if you do have any questions. And if you've got your own stories of deepfakes that have been used in your election, then maybe use the chat function to give us examples, perhaps links to news articles which give a bit more background into your own stories of deepfakes, disinformation, and elections. So I'll move on then to our first speaker for today. Our first speaker is Veronika Hintzeva-Frankowska. Veronika is an analyst and project manager at Demagog, a Slovakian fact-checking organization. And she is going to tell us a story about a deepfake audio controversy during the 2023 Slovakian elections, which has actually been mentioned in a previous session. So I think it's a perfect follow-on from our previous sections. So I would hope that Veronica could join us now and start her presentation. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much. I'm afraid you don't see me yet as on the camera, but that may change any moment that you will allow me to. Yes, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. As Tom introduced me, my name is Veronika Hincová-Frankovská, and I lead the Slovak fact check Demagogické. And I'm going to tell you a story about this year's elections in Slovakia, just to give you a very brief introduction into what is going on in Slovakia. We've had snap parliament elections by the end of September. Where the political scene was roughly divided into parties that were supporting Ukraine and those that were supporting more of the pro-Russian narratives of for example, going for peace. And it was swamped. The whole campaign was swamped in disinformation. It mostly focused on Ukraine, but also a lot of disinformation against the progressivism and liberalism. There was also a lot of disinformation on the topic of possible election fraud, and quite a few on migration. And it turned out that when you repeat lies enough, especially when not only some disinformation alternative media repeats them, but even elites and politicians, as is the case in our country, then a lot of people tend to believe it. For example, the repeated claim, which has no grounds, that our president Zuzana Čaputová is a US agent, was actually believed by 46% of our population. So this is where we started. And what we've come across was an audio AI generated recording. In the last week of the elections, we have a moratorium in Slovakia, which means that for the last 48 hours before the elections, the politicians or media should not in any way enter the campaign. Everybody should a bit of a calm down. And not introduced any new information. So a day before that, we have come across an AI audio recording of the leader of the Progressive Party, Michal Šimečka. And according to this recording, he was suggesting to drastically increase the beer prices in Slovakia. That it's going to be his first step after the elections. Now, I believe that you can imagine that it is not exactly a popular thing to do for a politician to increase the beer prices. Nevertheless, a lot of people did believe that this recording could be true. Maybe because we as fact checkers, of course, have been talking repeatedly about the dangers and possibilities of deepfakes. But I think more focus has been on potential use of videos rather than audio. And of course, even if the recording itself wasn't so good technically, a lot of people wanted to believe in it and wanted to share the sensational story of it. So we have looked at this video and debunked it on Wednesday before the elections that took place on Saturday. We have used an AI detection software, of course, which has limitations, and I believe that a lot has been said on this topic. But this one told us that there's a 98% of probability that it has been indeed AI generated. We have also reached out to Michal Šimečka himself, who strongly refuted any such claims, and it was also easy that no program of this sort was in fact suggested by the Progressive Slovakia party. And the video, well, the audio was also shared by channels that in the past have been spreading disinformation or propaganda. So it was relatively easy in this case not to take it too seriously. But it wasn't the end of it. As this was, I believe, some kind of a proof, a test, how the audience will react to it. What happened afterwards is that what circulated in Slovakia was another AI recording, and this time it was a lot more serious because it focused on, again, Michal Šimečka on one side and a journalist, Monika Todová, on the other, a journalist from Deník N. And they were, on this audio recording, they were as if talking about how exactly the rigging of the elections will take place. They were talking about who will send the envelopes, who will send some payments, what districts are secured, which are not. And to somebody who wanted to believe in such a story, it felt relatively convincing, although again, not very convincing from the technical point of view yet. Our colleagues from AFP Slovakia have fact-checked this recording, and they have used. They didn't choose to rely on any kind of detection software, but instead they addressed several experts in the field of combating cyber threats, but also. And hybrid information, hybrid war threats, and also on experts on artificial intelligence and technology, who have all considered this recording to be very likely AI generated. And you could hear that when you were listening in. Michal Šimečka was relatively well recorded, but especially Monika Todová used a voice that didn't sound very natural. It was more close to say neural voices that are used. Even despite that, even more people were spreading this video, which was also spread by some of our politicians. And there are estimates that at least 100,000 people have saw it on the social media, on Telegram, on Facebook, in chain messages, probably because people wanted to believe in it, because it played very well on how the stage was set. I have mentioned that the election manipulation narrative was already ongoing in Slovakia. Now, this had appeared back in March or February, when the first time not only disinformation media, but also political actors, including the party Smer, which eventually won the elections, warned people that there may be an election manipulation going on. First, it was aimed against the current government. That government was then replaced by a presidential government or an administrative government. Then the disinformation found other targets of who could possibly manipulate the elections. One of them being the Progressive Party, which was a runner-up in the elections. And at the time when this recording surfaced, it was actually leading the polls. And this narrative was so strong that in May, more than 50% of people in Slovakia actually believed that the elections could be manipulated. So the power that the disinformation had over people was actually that strong. And it wasn't even by chance. Michal Šimečka was himself a target of a lot of doubts and conspiracies in the weeks coming up to the elections. And it wasn't also by a chance that there was Monika Todová, because she had been before, by the beginning of August, a target of a smear campaign, almost a character assassination, as she was set up by self-proclaimed journalist from disinformation scene, and he uncovered her spending holidays with a friend who was a judge. Which was not a big problem, but the disinformation scene talked about it for weeks and considered that to be a proof that the journalists cooperate with the justice. So, as I said, it wasn't a chance that it was her chosen. And this recording really reached a lot of people, including, say, family members of our own fact checkers in our team. Precisely because it has hit on something that the people already want to believe to. Our colleagues at the Investigation Center of Jan Kuciak have looked into its background, and they have traced it to a politician on Telegram, Stefan Harabin, who has been before an unsuccessful candidate for president in Slovakia, and there it came together. It came from another private account, so we do not know exactly who started it. But at this time, the Russian agency RIA Novosti was actually giving out statements. That was on Thursday, that was already under the moratorium, that there is a chance that there is some US influence in Slovak elections. So it all came down to a perfect storm and a lot of people believing it. It has got us to several questions that we can maybe ask on the basis of this recording. If people were more like believe it or not, because it was audio, which is of course far cheaper to make. It was maybe even the results of several attempts to see which one catches on. For us fact checkers, it had been a great challenge of whether it can be really distinguished reliably, because we would love to have a simple tool that tells us yes or no. But of course, we have to be very careful about using it, because especially in Slovakia or Central Europe in general, there have been cases of audio recordings of politicians that have been even proofs of their activities that were not legal. And we can't risk handing them some kind of a get out of the jail free card by allowing them to say anytime they need to say, oh, but this might have been AI generated. And of course, there's the question of whether it is possible that it was artificial intelligence that could have flipped the results of the elections. We don't know, of course, but I'd say personally that I believe that the recording didn't reach people who weren't already convinced, but it could have played a certain role in the mobilization. And I think we can say that mobilization is a factor that plays a strong role in the elections. Thank you very much. I think that's all. That's all of the story for me, and I'm curious to hear from the other panelists.
Veronica, thank you so much for that really interesting story from Slovakia. And I think for me, one of the key points is around ongoing election manipulation narratives in lots of Commonwealth countries. There are both real concerns around election manipulation and also nefarious actors claiming election manipulation where it doesn't exist. And therefore, lots of Commonwealth countries and members of Parliament will be interested to see those ongoing election manipulation narratives and how they intersect with deepfake videos that could re-emphasize the narrative that already exists. So thank you very much for your presentation. We now go on to our second speaker. So I'm delighted to introduce Esra Özgürş from the TEYIT fact-checking organization in Turkey. Esra is the head of educational programs at TEYIT. She coordinates various educational activities, projects, and collaborations in the realm of critical digital literacy. Additionally, she is the editor of the article series called TEYITpedia, addressing issues related to misinformation, critical digital literacy, and fact-checking methods. Esra, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass over to you to tell a story about the impact of artificial intelligence on the 2023 Turkish elections. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Tom. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I didn't realize that you will read all this, like a brief introduction about us, so I sent it a very long version of it. But thanks. Hello, everyone. Let me start by sharing my screen so that you can see the presentation. I think it's on, right?
Yes, yeah, we can see it.
I'm Esra once again. I've been part of the TEYIT team for nearly 4 years at the moment, I believe. And I am excited to be here today to talk about our experiences we have faced during the recent elections that we had in Turkey in terms of information disorder and specifically AI. And as you may guess from the headline, our experiences gave us a specific case for this type of contents. I'm coming from TEİT. TEİT is a fact-checking organization aiming to make critical thinking a shared value for the agents of the information ecosystem in Turkey and in general. We have been operating since 2016, and 2016 was a time of high political uncertainty and attacks, explosions happened in major cities in Turkey, and this type of scene gave us the need of the creating the TEİT, I say. And elections are another critical time for us, for everyone, and it's essential that we believe that it's essential that people have access to accurate information before they cast their votes. And at TEİT, we are dedicated to ensuring the public is well informed. During this election period, we have conducted over 160 fact checks on election claims specifically, and 38 fact checks on statements made by the politicians themselves, and gathered the data afterwards for a report we published after every election period since 2016. But before delving into details, let me set the electoral scene in Turkey for you. We had a general and parliamentary elections in Turkey in May 2023. Two main candidates campaigned for the presidency. Also, although there were different actors with small vote shares and stuff like that, but one main candidate was Erdogan, the president and the chairman of the party that has been in power for at least last 20 years, and the other one is Kılıçdaroğlu, the candidate and the leader of the main opposition party in Turkey. While the advancements in AI technologies in 2023 offer extreme amounts of benefits, they also raise concerns, and these concerns create these type of meetings and events so that we can create some type of solutions along the way. But the technologies raise concerns for fact checkers and media, and the opposition party's candidates, Kılıçdaroğlu, sent a tweet just 3 days before the election, before the first rounds of election, and warned people about the deepfake videos in general. And this tweet, this warning, brought this issue to the forefront of Turkey's general agenda. And after Kılıçdaroğlu's warning, fact checkers, media, and all TV channels started to discuss about deepfakes and AI technologies. Nevertheless, during the election campaigns, our team encountered cheap fake contents created with less sophisticated tools rather than the deepfake videos. On the screen, you see the percentages of the types of false information we published during the election time, like misleading, false connection, manipulation, parody, fabricated contents, and cheap fakes and stuff like that. But the only viral, misleading, deepfake content, we had only one of them, was a video of the opposition party leader, Kılıçdaroğlu, saying that Erdogan is the leader of the century or stuff like that. It was a deepfake video created by AI, But other than that, the main false context, the main false claims that we see was the classic ones, I may say. One common type of election misinformation we encounter online is the use of edited media, manipulated pictures or graphics, specifically images of candidates that depict something false. These manipulated images can spread rapidly and influence public perception, even if they're not based in reality, as we speak before. For example, on the screen, there's a photo of President Erdogan and the former mayor of Ankara, the capital of Turkey, Melih Gökçek, that has been circulating on the internet for quite some time. It was a cheap fake, obviously, but it was one of the most viral contents that has been spread online during the election time. Oh, so sorry, just let me try to, yes. During the election period, one piece of cheap fake content has unmistakably overshadowed all the other similar false materials like these ones. At his Istanbul rally on May 7th, we had an election of May 15th. Erdogan displayed a video of featuring Murat Karayılan, which is a senior member of the Kurdish party and a militant organization called PKK that had been edited into a clip prepared for Kılıçdaroğlu's campaign video. Erdogan displayed a video depicting as if the PKK executives were singing for the main opposition party's election song. However, the footage has been edited. And none of the members does not appear in the campaign film for the 2023 Turkish general elections, or the video added to the campaign film is a video dated 2021, I believe. But the video was widely seen by the citizens on social media and news channels. In reality, the clip shared by Erdogan first circulated on social media in early May and was later featured by some of the news websites in Turkey. We published an analysis of this claim just hours after it was showcased at the rally. And also it's broadcasted live during the rally on TV. We published an analysis of this claim just hours after it was showcased at the rally. But despite the sensitive nature of the issue, the misleading aspects of this video did not gain widespread attention. When the footage was replayed at another rally, the issue became well known, and then we started to discuss in the media. Let me check the other context. Just before the second round of the election on May 22nd, Erdogan stated in a joint national TV broadcast saying that whether the video is edited or not, we know that PKK members have supported them with videos, is meaning the opposition party. And by this comment by Erdogan was interpreted as an acknowledgement that the video in question was fabricated. But needless to say, this type of behavior poses significant challenges for us fact checkers and media staffs in a political landscape where such fabrications are considered legitimate. The prospects become even more unsettling when contemplating the potential consequences as AI technologies continue to advance. And this case specifically reminds us that for many decades, technology capable of producing convincing fake content has existed, but the effectiveness of such attempts often often hinges more on factors like people's pre-existing trusts or political biases than the technology's capability to generate plausible contents. And at least in terms of election, I would like to say, maybe. And I think I will end my presentation in here. Thank you for your attention. And before leaving the floor for Silas, if you're interested, you can check the report on the screen. This report analyzes a comprehensive set of claims and identify and highlights reoccurring patterns that we had in the election in Turkey. And like case like that I mentioned just now. So thank you. Let me
Thank you very much, Esra. I think it was very interesting that only 0.5% of the disinformation shared during the election was actual deepfake content created by artificial intelligence, but that didn't necessarily define the fact that the cheap fake, more limited technology disinformation was just as effective as the deep fakes. And I'm sure that's something we'll come back to throughout this conference, the role of cheap fakes and edits and whether it actually matters that people know it's a fake piece of content. So thank you very much for your presentation, and the link to that report that Esra mentioned has been posted in the chat if anyone wants to do some further reading on that. So let's move now to our final speaker of day one, not just of this session, but of day one. Thanks everyone who's still with us for what's been a brilliant day of talks. The final speaker for today is Silas Jonathan. He's the head of digital investigations and OSINT at the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development and at Dubawa, and a distinguished fellow at the African Institute for Open Source Investigation. Silas is going to talk about the Nigerian elections of 2023 and offering us an African perspective on fact-checking and on AI and disinformation. So Silas, I'd invite you to come and give your presentation and share your screen, as well as I know you have some slides accompanying. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much, Tom, for this opportunity, and I'm glad that we are having this very important conversation in such a very important place, and I'm also glad to be talking about this topic. Can you confirm if you can see my screen?
Yes, yeah, we can see the presentation in full screen. That's excellent.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be looking at how fact checkers in Nigeria came together, of course, from our perspective at the Center for Journalism and Dubawa, and what we saw and how we do. I'm going to be picking out stories that stood up during the 2023 elections, and what is different when you put it in other context of elections in other continents, and also how this information plays in this context, and how AI and other synthetic media falls into the process. I'm from the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development. We are keen on accountability journalism, development, and other parts of journalism as well. We are key in the regions highlighted here, and our focus is to drive journalism and accountability and innovation, verification, all in terms of the future of journalism, field in technology, and that's what we're doing. And so let me just jump right in. So the context of Nigerian election, sort of the story has to start from the understanding that elections in Nigeria, it's a bit tricky in that there are layers to it that demands one to know the political context. I mean, I'm not from the US, but so much more because I read about the politics. I could almost even understand the context. But it's not so. There are so much nuances in the Nigerian political context that even to feed into it as a fact checker, demands more than just the understanding of the skill of fact checking. And so this is the unique thing that makes fighting disinformation during elections a bit tough. And this is some of the things that we've seen in Africa and across all the countries that we've worked, and specifically Nigeria. Unlike Western elections, where the disinformation is usually tied around policy and political party differences, Nigerian elections, has some distinctive outputs. You have like religious and ethnocentric electoral disinformation, political figures as focal points for the disinformation, usually tied to their religious or ethnic backgrounds. And also, there is a coordinated disinformation, mostly in echo chambers, also tied to religious or ethnic leanings. And then, of course, recruitment of led disinformation attacks targeting political candidates, also mostly as it relates to their religious or ethnic backgrounds. So, yeah, the Nigerian election of 2023 was a little different. Usually used to be a two-party election where you just find two key candidates. But then this time around, we had like 5 major candidates who were coming, who were pushing in. And that sort of tapped us up and prepared us sort of to say, oh, we need to wake up because this is really different. And even before the election, we understood that we needed to understand the conversation around. And so we put together a lot of fact checks that we have done just to understand from the typology of what we have. And it was not so surprising that we have more of influencers who are mostly, as we have believed, bankrolled by political parties to share decent misinformation. As you can see from the chat, most of them are either from influencers or from individuals or even groups on Facebook who are systematically and concurrently sharing those kinds of misinformation. And I'll go right into the kind of content that we have seen. And some of the things that we have seen is that we've seen key political candidates, key political figures, rather, who are major in political parties, being the ones who are sharing mis and disinformation, not just randomly, but even systematically. We've seen them having groups on Facebook, mostly opposing each other, and then fueling a sort of a coordinated sort of disinformation that is undermining either the election quality or undermining the candidate. And some of the thematic analysis that we have counted before the election, we understood that there is a lot of negative disinformation. Of course, all disinformation is supposed to be negative, but we had a lot of negative ones also tied to religious and ethnic lines, which could cause chaos, which could also discourage people to lose trust in the electoral process. And this is just so we could understand what we are going into. And just still ahead of the elections, we saw a lot of pictures that were taken out of context and then aligned with religious or ethnic conversations like this. This is an example of a fact check that a picture of a mosque that was demolished in Syria. It was now brought in and was targeted at a political candidate, saying that while he was governor, he demolished a lot of mosques because he's Christian. Do not vote for him, and you shouldn't vote for him as a president. And although there's no quality data to suggest he lost the election after all, but we can't really tie that to it. There's no data to support that, but it really was trending during those times before the election, and it was altering people's choices of candidate. Who should I vote for or not? And then we've seen key political figures who are supposed to be the source of good information, who are supposed to be answerable to the people, and the ones propagating fake news or misinformation based on their political leanings. And so it sort of called our attention to do a lot of pre-bunking and MIL, because in the African context, there is more information dirt than information overload. Most people don't even know, and so it is this gap that is most often used by disinformers to sort of fuel conversations that they want to achieve something with. And so we were able to sort of do a categorization of folks who we've seen constantly sharing this information. And it was striking, not so striking, but not so surprising, but striking to find out that a lot of spokespersons of either political parties or political candidates were the ones leading the disinformation. And the typology of kind of the contents they share it revolves around deepfake, audio deepfakes, which I'll show some examples, and the doctored image taken out of context, and even sometimes undermining the quality of the electoral process, saying, oh, this is what is being planned ahead of the elections, nobody should go and vote. And then so these are key political candidates, spokespersons of key parties who made big allegations, extra allegations, pushing for polarity in the politics of Nigeria ahead of the president. If you could see the third examples here, you say Peter Obi bribes Khan, and Khan is like the largest body of the Christian body in Nigeria, and because it is the largest body of Christian, and Peter Obi, who's the presidential candidate, is a Christian, sort of this kind of disinformation also comes up. But then most importantly, we've realized that AI plays a lot of role. But AI in the context of African elections, we have noticed, especially in Nigeria, is sort of a sphinx-like, sort of a two-face. It was good for us in one side, and it was bad for us in other side, because it was used by bad actors to fuel disinformation. They leverage on AI tools to fuel deepfakes. We saw a lot of bots. We did an analysis of that, research. We find so much bots fueling conversations and pushing disinformation in the social media sphere. And then, of course, a lot of fake accounts undermining democratic process. And some of the examples we saw was how some Twitter and Facebook accounts shared deepfakes to campaign for Nigerian president candidate. They sort of brought the faces of popular Hollywood actors and said, oh, this particular presidential candidate has a wide acceptance abroad, and if you could just vote for him, you're just aligning with the popular belief. But it was a deep fake, and a series of videos like that. It was massively reshared, sort of in a coordinated way. And because a lot of people don't even know that there is something like deepfake, it was so believable. And a lot of people were saying, oh, if Tom Cruise is supporting this candidate, then why shouldn't I? If Arnold Schwarzenegger is supporting, then I think I should. So it altered a lot of decisions. Perhaps no data to show that, but a lot of people who saw it, commented that I am going to really change my decision because of that. And it was also deepfakes were strategically used to malign female candidates who were trying to break the barrier of male-dominated politics. This is a woman who was contesting for a very key role that has traditionally been managed by men. And just days before the elections, they brought out a deep fake of her, a video of her just smoking in the club, and people were saying, is this who we're gonna vote? But then at the end of the day, when we carried out a fact check, we saw that it wasn't her, and the original picture is of this lady here. And so she lost the elections, and although no data to show that, but it was really a blow to her, because there's so much morality and religion in Nigeria, and something like this would really play a lot on the minds of gullible and vulnerable voters. And then you see another one we saw that was so prominent is how deepfake audio was used. We saw a lot of deepfake audio because a lot of people think that when a call is recorded, when a voice call is recorded, and it has to be true. I mean, these are their voices, and you can't even explain. There is a popular say in Nigeria, say you can explain, but there is no evidence because people think that this is true. And a lot of this is channeled because of the biases people have, the confirmation bias, which was raised earlier by Cassidy. People don't just want to disagree, And this audio really was a blow to this particular candidate because he was a key opposition party. He was a key opposition candidate, and it was a blow to him because the content was saying, how they were planning to rig the election, to buy voters, to buy votes and stuff like that. It trended on Twitter for days, and a lot of people gave up hope on him and based on their comments and the thematic voices they shared online. And another thing is astroturfing. We saw that the 5 key candidates had a lot of bot following. You could see that we tracked almost over 1.2 million bots before the election, and these bots, we were worried because they were pushing and promoting disinformation, and so it was like a battlefield on Twitter where if there's a disinformation that decimates the character or the personality of the other candidates, you see these ones will come and making it trend, and these bots were so active. But the main thing that even came up was when in this context, this another audio which was a deep fake came and said that one of the candidates is pushing for religious voting, that people should vote along religious lines. And it was so viral, and most experts in Nigeria do think that it really costed him the chances of becoming the president. During the election day, we saw a Twitter bot having the name of a prominent political figure, sharing election results even before it was officially released. I saw a lot of the news media platforms sort of picked the news and say, "Oh, this is the election result." A lot of them picked it because the man was a prominent person, but at the end, it was fake, and nothing happened. We had to put out this disclaimer just so people could take note of that. But AI also helped us. AI also helped us because when there was this plethora of things, tools such as Deepware, Hugging Face, PMIs, helps us to sort of verify information, and more of that again. The Full Fact tool, the Full Fact, it's a UK-based AI company. They sort of helped us to be able to source claims, because going through a lot of documents, going through a lot of articles could have taken so much time, and what the tool did was just to sum up, to just go through documents and pick out claims that may require fact checking. And that came up with so many things. You see, this is an example of some of the claims that we got that it helps us to. When political candidates come and do long speeches with a lot of numbers and digits, and we miss it, the Full Fact AI tool sort of captured it and just brings it to us. So it sort of became like we were on time and on spot with them, and they became so conscious at so many points in the election, saying, "Oh, you could go and fact check me. You could go." They knew that fact checkers were watching, and they became so conscious, but they couldn't tell how we were so fast to track what they're saying. But it was Full Fact AI tool that really helped us before, during, and even after the elections to track claims that may require fact checking. Also, the Google GNI also helped a lot, because we were able to. The partnership with the Google News Initiative helped us to train a lot of journalists on how to leverage tools before the elections. Even during the election, we had a lot of We use a lot of some of these tools to sort of verify and understand where the trends of conversations are going and where. At the end, what came so effective for us was the collaboration. We realized that we can't work in silos, and almost top fact-checking organization in Nigeria came together and say, hey, let's just come together and do this. And we had during the day to the election, we had a situation both in Lagos, in Abuja, key cities, and we did a lot of fact-checking and fact-checking during the elections, and we came up with good results. And after that, we had we fact-checked 83 claims, and out of these 83 claims, ridiculous facts came from them. We saw that there were massive interactions on social media on posts found to be false. It's like people are more interested on claims that were false. People were more interested in sharing it. And we also found that key political figures and spokespersons were significant sources of false information. Some of them are senators, some of them are in the legislature, but they are pushing for this kind when we did an analysis on some of the claims that we fact checked. And one thing again that drew our attention was that out of the fact check copies that we did, the 83 fact checks, 50% of them were all false, and predominantly around election violence, vote manipulation, and all of that. People saying this is what is happening in my community. Most times it's videos picked out of context. And another thing that we find so interesting was that image and video content emerged as a primary choice of content for disinformants. And Facebook and Twitter was the major platform they used. So there were a lot of cheap fakes in different kind of forms. The ones that are satirically motivated and the ones that are just pure blatant deepfakes, aiming to cause some political tension. And it was surprising because, as you can see, Twitter hosted most of these contents that are videos and that. At the end, we understood that lessons we've learned is that building effective digital monitoring strategies against elections is very important, and we are stretching out Dubawa is stretching out for more collaborative efforts. We are launching an active social media monitoring and analysis. We do not before the next elections, and even across Africa, we realize that election disinformation doesn't happen on the day of the election. It happens before, it happens during, it happens after. Dubai, we're launching an audio tool that helps to track the flow of disinformation on radio, because we have realized that a lot of disinformation, politically inclined, also flows on radio. And so there's a tool we're about to launch that checks that. Even in local languages, we realize that people mislead a lot. So the tool will be useful in that. We're trying to launch it across the Anglo African countries and West African countries, and of course we've been keen also on digital investigations to see how we could go about that, and all the lessons learned came to this recommendation, and this is it. I think it's very important that we hold key political figures accountable for their lies. There has to be some penalties when someone who is popular and politically inclined is caught spreading false information. Like the guy who shared fake accounts till today, nothing happened. So there has to be, because integrity of information, quality information has to be safeguarded. Another thing that is we need to allocate resources for researching and developing advanced technologies to sort of counter sophisticated disinformation tactics, especially in Africa. And lastly, we need to create a transparent channel between fact checkers, and just have this collaborative synchrony. And lastly, these are all the reference materials. You could read them. There's research on the typologies we've done, on the one on bots, and you could go through the methodology and all of that. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Silas, thank you so much. Really interesting to hear the different stories from the Nigerian election, to give that African perspective, as you said. and the kind of different challenges that brings in and a large election as well. You know, Nigeria is a huge country, so that brings with it its own additional challenges with elections at presidential level, but also at kind of national, state and local levels. So really interesting, and glad to hear that you're working in coalition with different partners across Nigeria and internationally to combat some of the challenges together, and actually using the same AI technology that bad actors are using to stop that spread of disinformation and misinformation. So thank you very much for your presentation on that. That brings us to the end of the session. I think we're going to do one question because I realize we're running a little bit over time. So I'm going to try and bring together some of the strands that have come through in the Q&A and some of the strands that have come through in the presentations into a single question, so we can hopefully bring Veronica back. Esther's had to leave, unfortunately, but if we could bring Veronica back as well, and Silas for one final question, and then I'll hand back to James for the final wrap up of today's conference. So I think what's clear from the presentations is that politicians, it's actually the politicians, the campaign spokespeople, the leaders who are quite actively involved, and you called it in a systemic way, Silas, in sharing this information. It's actually candidates and spokespeople and not just individuals. So what do we need to do to disincentivize this behavior for politicians to kind of stop them from doing this? There's a question in the chat about, has anyone been imprisoned for fraudulent behavior in elections? There's a question in the chat around electoral commissions and other election management bodies and their role. And Silas, your presentation finished with a suggestion about penalties. So if you could both just briefly say about what you think are the priorities for disincentivizing politicians from conducting this kind of behavior and being the progenitor of disinformation in this case.
Thank you, Tom, for this good question. Let me be brief with that. So in Africa, what we've seen in African context is that politicians want to regulate the social media to stifle freedom of information. That is not the goal. So the goal is to have clear punishments to say, if you have so amount of followers, there should be maybe with we are trying to bring the electoral body to have these things outlined to say, if you're so person and you have so followers and you mislead the public, there would be a fine. So instead of having a general social media regulation, it shouldn't be like that. We should have clear stated a punishment that is coming from the electoral bodies that would either fine politicians for massive disinformation, or if they are caught disinforming, or would either somehow bring them to public so that the public would be aware of the integrity of the politician. But if you ask me, I would say for now in the African context, to find them publicly and make it publicly would really go a long way, and it has to be a collaboration with the electoral body. I am not so keen on bringing laws that would stifle social media just because of this information, which is what most politicians are trying to do in African countries.
Excellent, thank you. Veronica, do you want to come in next?
Sure, well, it's a very good philosophical question. I will come with a bit of a contrapunct to Silas. I believe that this is more of a question of, well, the politicians should definitely be accountable for any kind of disinformation that they spread, because I think that we see this, that any country that where the elites and the politicians do join this fight with unfair weapons like disinformation is, that they suffer in democracy, in freedom of the people, and it is clearly connected. Nevertheless, I suppose I would leave it more to the role of the civil society and the media. because it really brings us on a thin ice if we allow any kind of electoral management body or politicians themselves to have some tools in which they will be able to say what is or isn't disinformation. It is problematic when it comes to, for example, the hybrid threats that we're currently facing in Europe coming from Russia, but they are around a variety of different contexts where we should be able to defend against them somehow. But I would be also rather wary about the possibility where we give the people too strong weapons to limit something, to censor something, because when the coins will turn, then it can very easily be changed. In Slovakia, it's actually very tricky because currently the Minister of Culture is a reporter from previously a disinformation online TV. So we're going to see in practice on how can this look in reality when hopefully the media in Slovakia will go through it as strong as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Veronica. I think those two responses point to the different contexts in which election management bodies operate, and that's true for the whole of the Commonwealth. We have different strengths and different weaknesses to election management bodies, and the regulatory landscape is very varied across the Commonwealth. So I think some of the key principles of response there were covered in both of your answers. My last thing to say is thank you to all of our presenters for this session. And thank you to all of our attendees throughout the day. We will be sharing the recordings, as James has mentioned, and some of the further reading that was mentioned throughout these presentations will be shared after the conference. And with that, I'll hand back to James to wrap up for day one of the conference. Thank you very much.